The night Elara left her diary in the king's library, she didn't know she had just handed a ruthless man the only weapon sharp enough to destroy her, or save the entire kingdom. One girl, one secret, one truth no one was supposed to read. She was a guard's daughter who dared to write down everything the powerful worked so hard to bury, and when the Alpha King found those pages, nothing would ever be the same again. Stay until the end. You won't regret it. Hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments right now. Let's go. The candle had burned down to nearly nothing. Elara pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the eastern corridor, her knees pulled to her chest, the small leather-bound diary balanced on her thighs. Around her, the castle breathed, the deep, slow exhale of thick walls and sleeping soldiers, of torchlight flickering in distant hallways, of a kingdom that had long since stopped paying attention to the daughter of a gate guard. That was fine. That was exactly how she needed it. She dipped the quill, pressed the tip gently to the page, and wrote, Day 312, since Father took the post at the northern gate. Day 47, since I first noticed the grain wagons leaving before dawn. Day 3, since the Miller family's youngest stopped coming to the village market. They say she's sick. I don't believe it. Sick children don't just vanish. Hungry ones do. She paused, tilting her head. Down the corridor, a pair of guards rounded the far corner, their boots echoing against flagstone. She drew her knees in tighter, pressing herself into the alcove behind the statue of the first Alpha, a massive, snarling stone wolf that had guarded this passage for 300 years. The guards didn't look her way. They never did. Elara waited until the sound of their footsteps faded before she exhaled. This was her life inside Iron Hollow Castle. Not the life of a noblewoman, not the life of a servant with clean quarters and steady meals. She existed somewhere in between, a guard's daughter who had grown up in the outer garrison, who knew every hidden passage and forgotten staircase, who had learned to read in the garrison's archive room by sneaking books meant for the steward's apprentices. She was 19 years old, sharp-boned and sharp-eyed, with the kind of face people looked past rather than at. She had decided, somewhere around her 14th birthday, that being invisible was not a weakness. It was a tool. The kingdom of Iron Hollow stretched across a land of dark forests and iron-veined mountains, where winter came 6 months out of the year and the wolves ran the ridgelines every full moon. It was not a soft kingdom. It had never pretended to be. The people here were hard-worked and plain-spoken, the kind of folk who valued a man's labor over his bloodline, or so the old stories claimed. But the old stories had been written before Lord Varric. Lord Varric Dane, brother to the late Alpha King Aldrich, uncle to the current king and blood regent of the eastern provinces, had been managing the kingdom's supply chains for nearly 6 years. He was a tall man with iron-gray hair and eyes the color of a clouded winter sky, the kind of eyes that looked at you warmly while calculating the exact cost of your existence. People who didn't know better called him gracious. They said he had a gift for administration, for logistics, for managing the complex machinery of a realm too vast for any one man to govern alone. Elara had been watching him for 2 years. She knew better. He doesn't manage the supply chains, she wrote, pressing harder into the page. He bleeds them, like a man who keeps a wound just open enough that no one notices the rot underneath. Not enough to cause alarm, just enough to feed himself. It had started small, or rather, she had started noticing small. A wagon that left the eastern granary 3 hours before the listed dispatch time. A set of numbers in the provisioner's ledger that didn't match the count she'd watched being loaded from the courtyard window above. A name, Crestfall Trading Company, appearing on requisition orders that no one in the lower garrison had ever heard of. She had asked questions, carefully, obliquely, the way her father had taught her. Don't ask what you want to know, he'd always said. Ask something nearby. People answer the questions they didn't know you were asking. The answers she pieced together were worse than she'd feared. Grain meant for the outer villages, Pete, the ones that sat farthest from the castle road, the ones that had no noble advocates and no market leverage, was being systematically redirected, not stolen outright, not dramatically, just quietly, consistently, over months and seasons, siphoned into a network of private warehouses under false company names, then resold to merchants in the south at nearly triple the provisioned price. The profit went somewhere Elara hadn't been able to trace yet. But the destination of the loss was obvious. She had seen it in the Miller girl's face at market, 3 weeks before she disappeared. The hollow cheekbones, the careful way she divided a single loaf into 5 portions, the look of someone who had learned not to expect enough. Elara had given her half her own lunch that day. The girl had cried, which had made Elara feel both better and desperately, furiously worse. The problem, and it was a problem she returned to with grinding regularity in the pages of her diary, was the king, Alpha King, Kaelin Dane, 26 years old, 6 years on the throne after his father died of a fever that moved too fast and left too few questions asked. Tall enough that he had to turn slightly sideways to pass through the narrower garrison doorways. Built like a man who trained not because it was expected of a king, but because he genuinely, almost recklessly, enjoyed it. She had seen him once in the lower training yard just after dawn, when the mist was still rising off the cobblestones and the castle was not yet fully awake. He'd been alone, or thought he was, moving through combat forms with a controlled ferocity that made the air around him feel sharper, denser, like standing near a thunderstorm that hadn't broken yet. She had watched from the upper gallery for 11 minutes before she made herself leave. She had written about it for 3 pages that evening and then spent another page furiously analyzing her own reaction, which she found humiliating and completely unhelpful. "He is not what I thought a king would be," she had written. "He doesn't perform power. He inhabits it. There's a difference, and I understand it better now that I've watched him when he thinks no one is looking." But that's the problem, isn't it? He has no idea what happens when he isn't looking. And I don't know if that makes him dangerously ignorant or deliberately blind. She had crossed that last line out and written it again, because she couldn't decide which would be worse. The king managed the kingdom's laws and military with what appeared to be genuine dedication. He sat in council sessions for hours. He reviewed border reports personally. He was not by any visible measure a lazy or careless ruler, but he trusted his uncle completely. Lord Varric had been regent for 2 years after the old king died, managing the kingdom while Kaelin, 20 years old and newly orphaned, consolidated authority over the fractious noble houses and military command structure that came with the Alpha throne. By the time Kaelin had full command, Varric's hand was already wound through every administrative branch of the kingdom like roots through old stone. And Kaelin had never thought to question the foundation. "Maybe he can't see it," Elara had written. "Or maybe he won't. I don't know which is worse, but I know this. If no one tells him, if no one shows him with proof in a way he cannot dismiss, then the kingdom bleeds until there's nothing left to take." She had paused at that point, quill hovering. "And I am a guard's daughter with a diary and a talent for being overlooked. So what exactly am I supposed to do about it?" She hadn't written an answer. Not yet. Tonight she was in the library. This required explanation, because the castle library was emphatically not a place that a garrison guard's daughter was supposed to be at 3 hours past midnight. It was on the 3rd floor of the castle's central tower, accessible through a corridor that passed the king's private study, and it was theoretically restricted to members of the council, senior scholars, and the royal household. Theoretically. The east servant staircase, however, connected to a small landing just off the library's rear access door. The rear access door had a latch that had been broken since the spring floods 2 years ago, when a panicking page had forced it in the wrong direction trying to escape the rising water in the lower stores. The latch had been logged as a repair request by the head steward's office on 3 separate occasions since then. It had not been repaired on any of those occasions. Elara had found this out the same way she found out most things, by paying attention to the information that existed in the gaps between official records. Tonight she needed the old surveying maps. She had a theory about where the private warehouses were located, 3 possible sites in the eastern foothills that matched the travel times and route patterns she'd been tracking from the dispatch logs. But she needed to cross-reference with the old boundary surveys from before the road realignments. Those surveys were in the library's Eastern Archive section. She had been putting this off for weeks because the risk was significant, but the Miller girl's empty spot at the market had been like a splinter in her mind, working deeper every day. So here she was. The library was enormous and dark, and smelled of old paper and cedar oil and the particular cold that lived in stone rooms that were never quite warm. Elara moved through it with a small hooded lantern, navigating by memory and the pale silver of moonlight through the tall windows. The archive section was in the back, separated from the main reading room by a pair of floor-to-ceiling oak shelves that acted as a wall. She found the survey. She found the boundary maps. She spread them on the low reading table in the archive corner and began working, cross-referencing with the notes she'd copied carefully in the smallest writing she could manage, into the back pages of her diary. She was so focused that she didn't hear the door. She didn't hear the footsteps. She didn't know she was not alone until a voice said, from approximately 4 feet behind her, "The library closes at midnight." Elara moved so fast she knocked the lantern sideways, nearly tipping it, caught it with both hands, spun around with her heart slamming against her ribs. He was standing at the edge of the archive shelves, one shoulder against the oak frame, arms loosely crossed, wearing a dark training tunic and no crown. His hair was slightly damp, like he'd come from the training yard. His eyes, dark gray, the color of iron in low light, were on her face with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not quite surprise, not quite suspicion. Something more like assessment. Alpha King Kalen Dane. In person, closer than she had ever been, he was larger than he looked from the gallery. Not dramatically, violently large. Not performing for the court large. Just solidly, unavoidably present in a way that made the archive corner feel considerably smaller than it had a moment ago. Elara's wolf, the animal part of her that lived somewhere behind her sternum, the instinct she spent considerable energy keeping carefully managed, lurched toward him like a compass needle swinging north. She nearly choked on the sensation. Not now, she thought, with a kind of desperate internal urgency. Absolutely not now. She started. "That's a surveying map," he said, glancing at the table. His voice was even, unhurried. "Old ones. Pre-realignment." She stopped, started again. Her mind, which was usually reliable under pressure, was doing something unhelpful involving the distance between them and the way the moonlight came through the window at exactly the wrong angle. "I had permission from—" She stopped again because that sentence was going nowhere good. A beat of silence. "You're Oren's daughter," he said. "The North Gate captain." The fact that he knew her father's name and connected it to her face was so far outside her expectations that she simply stared at him for a full second. "Yes," she managed. "Elara." "Elara." He said it once, like he was filing it somewhere. "Why are you in the restricted library at 3 in the morning with pre-realignment surveys and a hidden lantern?" "Research," she said, which was true and also the worst possible answer. He looked at her with the particular steady expression of a man who was very good at waiting for people to say more. Elara recognized the technique because she used it herself. She was not going to say more. "I'll leave," she said instead, and began quickly, too quickly, gathering the maps to return them to the shelf. Her hands were not entirely steady. Her wolf was still doing the compass needle thing, and she was spending an enormous amount of concentration not letting it show on her face. She folded the last map, replaced it, picked up her lantern, her diary, except the diary wasn't in her hand. It was on the table. She was already at the archive door. She could see it on the table in her peripheral vision, lying flat, the leather cover dark against the pale wood, the strap that kept it closed slightly undone because she'd been working from the back pages. She looked at the door. She looked at the diary. She looked at the king, who was watching her with that same steady, unhurried attention. The door was 4 steps away. The table was 3. "Go back," said every rational part of her brain. "Go back and get it. Right now. Whatever he thinks of you doesn't matter. Get the diary." But her wolf was still pulling toward him in a way that felt like standing too close to a fire, and her heart was still running from the shock of being found, and the distance to the door felt like a clear path, and the distance to the table felt like walking directly into everything she had spent months carefully avoiding. She made the worst decision of her life. She went through the door. Bakicho. Elara didn't stop moving until she reached the servants' staircase landing 2 floors down, where she pressed herself against the wall, lantern clutched to her chest, and tried to breathe normally. The diary was still on the table. "Oh no," she whispered. It came out in a voice that didn't sound like hers. "Oh, no, no, no." She made herself think. The diary was closed, the strap was loose, but the cover was down. There was no name written on the cover. She had never been foolish enough to put her name on it. The handwriting inside was hers, recognizable if you'd seen her other writing, which the king almost certainly had not. The contents were devastating, not just because of what she had written about the grain shipments and the provisioners' records and Lord Varick's network. Those would be dangerous enough. But she had been writing in that diary for 8 months, with the honest, unguarded freedom of someone who absolutely believed no one would ever read it, and that meant the full contents included, in addition to her documented observations of kingdom-wide corruption. 11 separate entries about Alpha King Kalen, ranging from careful political analysis to the deeply embarrassing 11-minute observation from the gallery to a 3-page section she had titled, in a moment of dark humor, "Why My Wolf Has Terrible Taste and Absolutely No Sense of Self-Preservation." She closed her eyes. She needed to go back and get it. Now. Before he found it. Before he picked it up out of curiosity or instinct, or just because he lived here and it was sitting on his library table. She made herself turn around and go back up the stairs. She pushed the access door open 1 inch and looked through the gap. He was standing at the archive reading table. The diary was open in his hands. Elara stood very still for a full 3 seconds, watching him through the crack in the door, with the specific sensation of watching a catastrophe you had already set in motion arrive at exactly the speed you feared it would. Then she closed the door, very quietly, and walked back down the stairs. There was nothing left to do. He had it. He was reading it. Her careful, furious, honest, mortifying 8 months of truth were in the hands of the man she had written about most, trusted least, and, she could acknowledge this now, at least, in the ruins of the moment, thought about far more than was wise. She reached the lower garrison corridor and stood in the dark for a long time. The question was no longer whether she would be found out. The question was what he would do when he finished reading. Elara had grown up with her father's practicality and her mother's stubbornness. Her mother had died when she was 11, of a winter fever, and Elara had spent the years since learning to carry both her parents' qualities at once, because there was no longer anyone else to share the weight. Her father, Oren, was a good man in the specific, uncomplicated way of men who had decided early on that they would simply do their job honestly and let the world arrange itself as it liked. He was not ambitious, he was not naive, he was the most reliably decent human being Elara had ever known, which was part of why watching what was happening to the kingdom made her so relentlessly furious. Oren would not do anything about it. Not because he was cowardly, but because it genuinely would not occur to him that it was his place to act. He would see the same things she saw, would find them troubling, and would ultimately fold them into the category of things above my station and continue doing his job. Elara could not do that. She was not sure if this was courage or simple stubbornness. She had written about this distinction in the diary, too. The question of whether she was genuinely principled or just constitutionally incapable of letting things go. The answer, she suspected, was some uncomfortable combination of both. She had started the diary as documentation, pure, practical documentation, a record of specific observations in specific locations at specific times, the kind of evidence that might, someday, be useful to someone with the actual power to act on it. She had never had a clear plan for what that meant or how it would work. She had simply kept recording because recording was what she could do. And doing something, even something small, even something no one might ever see, was better than the alternative. Except now someone had seen it. And it wasn't just the evidence that had been seen. All of it had been seen. She didn't sleep that night. She lay on the narrow cot in the garrison quarters she shared with 2 other secondary status residents, a blacksmith's apprentice and a scribe's assistant, both of whom were deeply asleep and unaware of anything, and watched the shadows move across the ceiling as the torches outside the window burned lower. She thought about what the diary said about Lord Varick. She had been careful as she knew how, to ground every observation in specific detail. Dates, times, locations, wagon markings, ledger discrepancies, the name Crestfall Trading Company, and the 3 entries about the company's registered address, an address she had eventually tracked to a building in the south quarter of the nearest city that, when she had managed to get eyes on it through a courier friend, turned out to be a completely empty warehouse with a freshly painted sign and no employees. If the king read those entries and believed them, or even took them seriously enough to investigate, there was a chance. There was a real possible chance that something could change. But she had also written things she hadn't intended for any eyes but her own. He trained alone in the yard this morning, she had written. In the entry she was now finding most catastrophically ill-timed. I don't know why I watched as long as I did. It wasn't useful information. I told myself I was observing his habits for context, which is the kind of lie I'm apparently capable of telling myself with a straight face. The truth is I watched because there's something about him when he doesn't know anyone's looking. Some quality he loses when he puts the king back on along with the crown, that I find completely unreasonably difficult to look away from. Which I am writing down because the whole point of this diary is to be honest, and I might as well be honest with myself even when it's embarrassing. My wolf doesn't help. She has been aggressively useless on the subject of the Alpha King since approximately the 3rd time I saw him at any distance closer than 30 feet, and I have given up expecting her to be rational about it. She had, in subsequent entries, referred to this quality 3 more times. In varying degrees of analysis, and in one entry written at 2 in the morning after a particularly frustrating day with considerably less analytical distance than she would have preferred. She covered her face with both hands. There was nothing to be done about it now. The diary was in his hands. Whatever came next was already in motion. She thought about the Miller girl. She thought about the empty grain wagons. She thought about the 3 years of patient, careful, largely invisible work she had done to build a picture of what was actually happening in this kingdom, written in the pages of a book she had never expected anyone to read. If she was going to be destroyed, at least let it count for something. That was, she decided somewhere near dawn, the most she could hope for. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she slept without dreaming about grain ledgers. 2 days passed. Nothing happened. No guards came to the garrison. No summons arrived at her father's post. No message, no consequence. No indication at all that the world had shifted on its axis, and she simply hadn't felt it yet. On the 3rd day, she saw the king at the south courtyard from the upper walkway. A brief crossing while she was carrying a message for her father from the provisioner's office. And for one terrible moment, their eyes met across the distance. He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked away and continued walking, unhurried, as if nothing had happened. Elara spent the rest of that afternoon trying to determine what that meant. She was in the middle of her 4th theory when her father appeared in the garrison doorway with the particular expression he wore when something was wrong, and he had not yet decided how to say it. "Elara," he said, "were you in the castle library 3 nights ago?" Her stomach dropped. "I needed the boundary surveys," she said, "for the route analysis. I was going to tell you, 3 soldiers from the castle guard came to my post this afternoon," he said quietly. "They asked if you'd been anywhere near the upper floors recently." He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them, in the silence, was the weight of everything she hadn't told him. The 8 months of documentation, the diary, the grain wagons, the name Crestfall Trading Company written in careful handwriting in a book currently in the possession of the Alpha King. "Dad," she said. "What did you do?" he asked. Not accusatory, not afraid, just asking, the way he always asked, straight, direct, ready to hear the real answer. "I've been keeping records," she said, "about the supply diversions, the grain routes, the provisioners' ledgers." She paused. "I may have accidentally left the records somewhere they shouldn't be." Her father sat down on the garrison bench. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up at her with the expression of a man who had known his daughter for 19 years and was not, in the end, particularly surprised. "Tell me everything," he said. So she did. She told him about the first wagon she'd noticed leaving early. She told him about the ledger discrepancies in Crestfall Trading Company and the empty warehouse with the freshly painted sign. She told him about the boundary survey maps and the 3 sites in the eastern foothills she suspected. She told him about the king and the library, and the door and the diary still open on the table when she looked back through the gap. She did not tell him about the sections she'd written about the king. That was a separate category of problem that she was going to manage, or not manage, independently. Her father listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the garrison was very quiet. Outside, the night watch was changing. She could hear the call and response of the guard rotation echoing across the outer walls, the familiar rhythm of it, steady and unchanging. "You should have told me," he said at last. "I know. Not because I would have stopped you." He looked at her steadily. "Because you shouldn't have been carrying this alone." Something in Elara's chest, which had been tightly coiled for months, shifted slightly, just slightly. "I didn't want to put you at risk," she said. "Your post, your standing, if it came to nothing, my standing is worth less than my daughter," he said flatly, in the tone that meant this was not a point he would argue. "And if what you've written is accurate—" He paused. "Is it accurate? All of it?" "Every entry is dated and sourced," she said. "Every observation I could cross-reference, I cross-referenced. I know what I saw." Oren was quiet again. The torchlight moved across the wall. "Then one of 2 things is going to happen," he said finally. "Either the king reads it and acts on it, or he doesn't." He looked at her. "If he doesn't, we need to be ready to move, quietly, quickly." Elara nodded. "And if he does?" she asked. Her father looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite name. "Then," he said, "I hope you wrote it clearly." Why, she had. She was reasonably sure she had. And in the 5 days of silence that followed, she held on to that certainty the way you hold on to a rope in a current, not because you're sure it will hold, but because it's what you have, and letting go is not an option. In her garrison room, on the narrow cot, she lay awake and thought about what it meant that she hadn't been arrested yet. She thought about what it meant that the king had looked at her in the courtyard and said nothing. She thought about the Miller girl somewhere in the outer villages, dividing bread into 5 pieces. She thought about truth, about whether the act of writing something down was a form of courage or a form of cowardice, whether it was braver to act or to document, whether the words she'd put on those pages would ever reach the people who needed to read them. She had no answers, but she was still here, and the diary was still out there, somewhere in the castle's upper floors, carrying 8 months of her most honest and unguarded self in the hands of the one man in the kingdom with both the power to change things and every possible reason not to. She closed her eyes. She waited. Outside, the wolves ran the ridgeline, their voices carrying across the dark mountain forest, wild and clear and utterly indifferent to the very human problem unfolding in the castle below. Her own wolf stirred at the sound, turned toward the north, toward the high ground, toward something she couldn't quite name and had spent 8 months trying not to think about too carefully. Not now, she told herself, as she had told herself in the library, in the corridor, in every unguarded moment when her instincts reached toward something her reason refused to sanction. The wolves ran on. The castle slept, and Elara, lying in the dark with her hands folded on her chest and her jaw set, with the particular stubbornness that had been her defining quality since she was old enough to have a defining quality, made herself breathe slowly and wait, and trust that truth, patient, documented, unignorable truth, was worth something, even when the only one who had read it was the man she had the worst possible reason to trust. It has to be worth something, she thought. Outside the window, a wolf howled once, high and clear and fierce, and the sound carried all the way down to the garrison walls, through the cold glass, into the small dark room where a guard's daughter lay awake in the ruins of her careful secrecy, waiting to find out if honesty was a weapon or a wound. She didn't know yet. She suspected, before it was over, she would know for certain. The 7th morning arrived the same way the previous 6 had, cold, gray, and indifferent to Elara's situation. She had developed a routine in the days since the library. Wake before the garrison bell. Check the corridor outside the garrison quarters for anything unusual. Eat whatever was available at the lower kitchen without drawing attention. Carry out her father's messages and administrative tasks for the Northgate Post with the precise, unremarkable efficiency of someone who had absolutely nothing to hide and was certainly not waiting every single moment for the sound of boots coming her way. The waiting was its own kind of torture. It was worse, in some ways, than she had expected. She had imagined, in the planning she'd done before this all fell apart, that if someone ever found the diary, the consequences would be immediate. Discovery, confrontation, consequence. Clean and fast, the way a blade was clean and fast. What she had not prepared for was this: the specific, grinding uncertainty of not knowing whether the blade had been raised or set aside, whether the king had read every word or simply confiscated the diary as a security matter and handed it to his chancellor without opening it, whether she was already condemned and simply hadn't been told yet. On the 7th morning, sitting on the garrison steps in the pale early light with a cup of something that approximated tea, Elara made herself stop waiting. Whatever was going to happen, she couldn't control it. What she could control was what she did while it was happening. And what she should be doing, what she would have been doing if she hadn't lost the diary, was continuing to build the case. She still had her memory. She had the notes she'd already made. She had 2 other sources she'd been meaning to approach for weeks. She set down the tea. She stood up. She went back to work. The provisioner's assistant was a round-faced young man named Davin, who had held his position for 11 months and already had the slightly haunted look of someone who had encountered more paperwork than he had ever anticipated when he accepted the job. Elara had cultivated him carefully over several months, not with any deception, but with the simple, consistent currency of being useful. She helped him decode the old supply notation systems that the current provisioner refused to translate. She corrected his measurement conversions without making him feel foolish about the errors. She was, in his words, the only person in the lower castle who actually knows what these old ledgers mean, and will tell me without being condescending about it. She found him in the provisioner's outer office that morning, surrounded by 3 months of winter allocation documents, and looking like a man who had lost a fight with the concept of organization. "Elara." He looked up with the expression of a drowning man spotting a rope. "Tell me you have time to look at these Eastern route calculations. The numbers don't reconcile, and I've been staring at them for 2 hours." "Show me," she said, settling into the chair across from him. He spread the documents between them. She looked at them for 40 seconds. "Your base weight is wrong," she said. "The provisioner uses long hundredweight for the Eastern routes and standard hundredweight for everything else and never marks which is which. If you're using standard here," she pointed, "you're off by 12% across every Eastern calculation." Davin stared at her. Then he looked at the papers, then back at her. That would mean every Eastern allocation for the past 3 years probably, she said, since the route realignment. That's an enormous discrepancy." "Yes," she said. Then, carefully keeping her voice at exactly the same register it had been, "What happens to the difference on the Eastern routes when the allocation and the delivery don't match?" Davin frowned. "It should be logged as variance, filed with the Eastern District reports." "Do you have those reports?" He looked at the stack of documents surrounding him. "They should be here somewhere. The Eastern District reports go to Lord Varick's administrative office, not directly to the provisioner's files, so I only have copies, not the originals. But they should—" He started shifting through the stack. "Here, Eastern District Quarterly, last year." He pulled it out, scanned it. His frown deepened. "The variance column is blank. All 4 quarters?" He checked. "All 4 quarters." Silence settled over the provisioner's office, warm with the smell of paper and ink and the low fire in the corner grate. "That's a clerical error," Davin said, in the tone of a man who knew it wasn't a clerical error and was giving himself a moment to adjust to that knowledge. "Probably," Elara agreed, in the tone of a woman who had 7 months of documentation suggesting it absolutely wasn't. She left the provisioner's office 20 minutes later with a clear confirmation of something she'd suspected but hadn't been able to prove directly. The variance in the Eastern route allocations, the portion of the 12% discrepancy that should have been logged and reported, was being consistently, systematically suppressed from the official record. The grain was disappearing from the paperwork at exactly the same point it was disappearing from the wagons. Lord Varick's administrative office was the last place those numbers passed through before they vanished. It was not proof of anything, technically. It was a pattern, a convergence, the kind of thing that, taken alone, a skilled administrator could explain away in 10 minutes with 3 plausible alternative theories. But Elara had never been building a single piece of proof. She had been building a structure, and one more beam had just slid into place. She was crossing the middle courtyard just after midday, hands deep in her coat pockets, mind working through the calculation of how many more pieces she needed before the structure was complete, when she walked directly into the path of a man she had been avoiding for the better part of a year. Lord Varric's personal steward, a lean, colorless individual named Seth, who wore his authority like a coat that didn't quite fit and had the specific quality of unpleasantness that came from being a small power in close proximity to a large one, stopped in front of her with the expression of a man who has just found something mildly interesting stuck to his boot. "Garrison girl," he said. Not her name. He had never once used her name. "You're Oren's daughter." "Yes," she said. "Lord Varric has been asking about the library incident." His eyes were flat, assessing. "One of the cleaning staff reported a lamp in the archives section 3 nights before last." "You wouldn't know anything about that?" It was not a question. "I was delivering a message to the 3rd-floor steward's office," she said. The lie was already prepared. She had prepared it, carefully, in the first 48 hours after the library, when she'd had time to think clearly. "I heard a noise from the library corridor and checked, saw nothing and moved on." Seth looked at her for a long moment. "Lord Varric takes security in the upper castle very seriously," he said. "As he should," Elara agreed. Another moment. Then he moved past her without another word, and Elara continued across the courtyard at exactly the same pace she'd been walking before, her face neutral, her heart running at considerably more than its resting rate. Varric was asking questions. She didn't know if that was because he'd learned something specific, or simply because he was, as her diary had described in several different ways, the kind of man who kept his hands on every thread in the web as a matter of habit. Either way, it was a reminder that time was not a resource she had in unlimited quantity. She thought about the diary, about the king's hands on the pages, about what he had read, and whether he had believed it. Do something with it, she thought, with a fierceness she couldn't quite keep contained. Whatever you think of me, whatever you thought when you read it, do something with what I gave you, because I cannot do it alone, and people are hungry, and the man asking questions about me right now is the reason. She didn't let herself look back across the courtyard to see if Seth was still watching. She already knew he was. What Elara did not know, what she had no way of knowing, walking across that courtyard with Seth's flat eyes at her back, was what had been happening in the upper floors of Iron Hollow Castle for the past 7 days. She did not know that the king had read the diary in one sitting, standing at the archive table, not moving for 2 hours except to turn pages. She did not know that he had read it again the following morning, this time at his desk in the private study, with a lantern and a cup of tea that went cold because he kept forgetting it was there. She did not know that by the 3rd morning, Kaelin Dane had stopped reading it as a document and started reading it as a reckoning. He had begun, with the controlled, methodical precision that was the backbone of how he approached anything he could not immediately resolve, at the front. The early entries, her first observations of the wagon timing, her cross-references with the provisioner's records, her discovery of the Crestfall Trading Company name, and her quiet, careful, frankly impressive tracking of that name through 4 different administrative documents across a 9-month period. What had struck him first was not the content, it was the method. She had no access to the council chamber, no standing in the administrative hierarchy, no allies with authority or reach. She was a garrison guard's daughter with a reader's habit and a sharp mind, and absolutely no official standing to do anything with what she observed. And yet she had built, over the course of 8 months in the cracks of a system that considered her invisible, a more detailed and precisely sourced analysis of his eastern supply networks than anything that had crossed his council table in the past 3 years. He had gone to the provisioner's archive himself, on the 4th day, at an hour when the office was empty. He had pulled the Eastern route allocations. He had found the blank variance column. He had sat with that document in his hands for a long time. He has no idea what happens when he isn't looking, Elara had written. And I don't know if that makes him dangerously ignorant or deliberately blind. He had read that line 3 times. Each time it had landed differently. The first time like an accusation, the second time like a challenge. The third time, uncomfortably, like a mirror. He was not blind. He was not, he told himself, needed to tell himself, deliberately ignoring the evidence in front of him. But he had trusted Varric completely. He had trusted Varric because Varric had been the fixed point during the worst years, the period after his father died, when the kingdom's noble houses had circled like wolves testing the boundaries of a new pack leader, when the military command structure had fractured along 3 different loyalty lines and taken 2 years of relentless, exhausting work to consolidate. Varric had managed the domestic administration with what appeared to be seamless competence. He had provided stability when everything else was shifting. He had been, as far as Kaelin could determine, doing exactly what a regent was supposed to do. Or, said the voice in his head that had been getting louder since the 4th morning, he had been doing exactly what a man who wanted to establish himself as indispensable would do, while using the cover of your consolidation crisis to build the infrastructure for everything that came after. Kaelin was very good at not reacting visibly to things. It was a quality he'd developed early and refined with intention. The understanding that in his position, the way he received information told people as much as the information itself, and that losing control of his expression was losing control of a conversation before it started. He had sat through the Provisioner's archive on day 4 with his face carefully neutral. He had returned to the castle at the normal time and eaten dinner at the council table with Varric 2 seats to his left, and he had looked at his uncle and listened to him speak and held everything he'd been reading for 4 days behind a neutral expression while Varric talked about the southern timber tariffs. He had been good at it. He wasn't sure it had felt like enough. On the 5th day, he had reached the sections that were not about the kingdom. He had known they were coming. He'd caught the first reference on his initial read, a passing, somewhat abrupt sentence about training habits and observation that he'd noted and then deliberately moved past in order to continue assessing the documentation. He had intended to return to those sections with the same methodical approach he'd used for the evidence sections. He had not been methodical about it. Elara's entries about him were unlike anything else in the diary, unlike anything anyone had ever written about him, as far as he was aware. And people had written a great many things about the Alpha King that he had access to if he chose to seek them out. Court correspondence. Noble houses assessing his decisions and motivations with the cool interest of people calculating their own strategic positions. Reports from border commanders. A flattering but largely fictional portrait commissioned by the council for the kingdom's ceremonial record that made him look considerably more serene and considerably less complicated than he had ever felt. None of those had sounded anything like Elara. She had written about him the way she wrote about everything, direct, specific, grounded in exactly what she had observed, with the same precision she applied to wagon departure times and ledger discrepancies. But there was something else in those entries, something that sat beneath the analysis and surfaced in moments she seemed to recognize as unguarded, moments where her voice shifted slightly from the careful, controlled documentation he'd come to recognize as her default register. He doesn't perform power, she had written. He inhabits it. There's a difference, and I understand it better now that I've watched him when he thinks no one is looking. He had read that and felt something he couldn't quite name settle in his chest. Not vanity, because it wasn't flattering in the way court compliments were flattering. It was more like being accurately described by someone who had no reason to describe you accurately, no gain in it, writing into what she believed was permanent privacy. My wolf doesn't help, she'd written, further on, in the entry that had kept him awake for 2 nights. She has been aggressively useless on the subject of the Alpha King since approximately the 3rd time I saw him at any distance closer than 30 feet, and I have given up expecting her to be rational about it. His own wolf had been loud since the night in the library. Not in the frantic, undisciplined way of a young wolf responding to proximity. This was something quieter and more insistent, a steadiness, a recognition, a pull in a specific direction that had nothing to do with impulse and everything to do with something his animal nature had identified and was now simply, patiently, waiting for the rest of him to catch up with. He had not written about this anywhere. He was not Elara. He did not keep a diary. But sitting in the private study on the 5th day, with the lantern burning low and the Eastern Supply documentation spread on one side of the desk and the diary open on the other. He had spent a long time with both of them in his field of vision, thinking about the specific, remarkable quality of a person who documented the king's corruption and her own involuntary feelings about the king in the same handwriting, with the same precision, in the same pages, as if honesty was not something she could turn off even when it was uncomfortable. He had never met anyone who was honest in exactly that way. He had not thought it was possible to find it both intensely inconvenient and completely impossible to dismiss. On the 6th day, he had sent 3 trusted soldiers, not garrison, not connected to any of Varick's administrative networks, to the eastern foothills with specific coordinates pulled from Elara's notes. On the morning of the 7th day, they had returned. They had found 2 of the 3 sites. The warehouses were real. He saw her in the middle courtyard just after midday on the 7th day, which was also the day his soldiers came back with confirmation of the warehouses. He was crossing from the east wing to the council building when he noticed her. The distinctive quality of her movement, that particular combination of purposeful and carefully unremarkable, which he had now catalogued enough to recognize at distance. She was talking to Seth. Kaylin stopped walking and observed the exchange from 40 feet away, outside her line of sight. Seth's body language was the specific combination of authority and menace he used when delivering messages he expected to land as warnings. Elara's body language was still, controlled, giving nothing. When Seth moved on, Kaylin watched her continue across the courtyard without looking back. The set of her shoulders was the only tell, a fractional tension in her posture that someone who hadn't been reading her words for 7 days wouldn't notice. Varick was tracking her. The conclusion was immediate and unwelcome. Whatever Varick knew or suspected about the library, about what might have been in the archives section that night, about what a garrison guard's daughter might have observed and recorded over 8 months. He was paying attention to her. Kaylin needed to move faster. He changed direction, walking away from the council building toward the castle's private wing, and composed in his mind as he walked the exact set of orders he was going to give the 3 men who now owed him an unreported trip to the eastern foothills. The evidence was in the warehouses. The warehouses were confirmed. What he needed now was documentation that connected the warehouses to Varick's administrative network in a way that could not be explained, dismissed, or argued around in a council chamber. He needed the falsified records, the original orders, not the copies, the financial flow between Crestfall Trading Company and wherever the money ultimately landed. He had an idea about where to find them. And he recognized this clearly, a timeline problem. Because Varick was asking questions about a specific garrison guard's daughter, and if Varick reached the same conclusions about what she might have observed and documented before Kaylin had built a case that was unassailable enough to act on, then the woman who had been doing his job for him, invisible and alone, for 8 months, was in genuine danger. That was not something he was willing to allow. He also recognized, with the self-awareness that the diary had, somewhat uncomfortably, sharpened in him, that his unwillingness to allow it was not entirely administrative. He let that recognition sit and said nothing to anyone about it, because there were more pressing matters, and because some things required more time than he currently had. Well, the council session 3 days later was a routine administrative meeting. Supply allocations, border security updates, the ongoing negotiation with the western trade routes. Varick sat in his customary position 2 seats to the king's left, silver-haired and steady, managing his portion of the agenda with the practiced fluency of a man entirely at home in the room. Kaylin had sat through hundreds of these sessions. He knew the rhythm, the cadence, the way Varick's reports always arrived complete and confident, and framed in language that made further questions feel redundant. This time he listened differently. He listened the way Elara had taught him to listen, without realizing that was what her writing had done. The method she described in early entries, her father's instruction. Don't ask what you want to know. Ask something nearby. He heard, beneath Varick's competent presentation, the specific architecture of a man who had spent years ensuring that the questions he didn't want asked would never occur to the people who might ask them. The Eastern Supply Report came up midway through the session. Allocations are tracking to projection, Varick reported, his voice carrying the particular warm authority of a man stating something he expects to be believed without examination. Some variance in the outer district routes, within seasonal norms. No corrective action required. Kalen looked at the report in front of him. The variance column, as always, was blank. "Lord Varick," he said. Varick looked at him with the patient, slightly indulgent expression he used for questions he expected to answer easily. "What's the definition of seasonal norms for the eastern outer routes? Specifically, at what variance threshold does the report move from no corrective action required to flagged for review?" A beat. Brief. Almost imperceptible. Then, 12% of projected allocation, sire. Standard administrative practice across all districts. And the current eastern variance? Within range, as the report indicates. Can you give me the current number? The council table was quiet. Not uncomfortably. No one else in the room seemed to find the question remarkable. Varick's expression remained patient. "I'll have the detailed figures sent to your study," he said. "I'd like them now," Kalen said, evenly, unhurried. Another beat, longer this time. "I don't have the detailed breakdown in front of me," Varick said, with the smoothness of long practice. "I can have it before end of day." Kalen nodded and moved on to the next agenda item. And for the rest of the session, he watched Varick from the periphery of his attention. The slight additional stillness in his posture, the way his stylus moved across his notes, with fractionally less ease than it had before the question. The king had asked about the numbers, and Lord Varick, who never arrived anywhere unprepared, had not had the numbers. After 6 years of sitting in this room, in this session, accepting every report that landed in front of him, that was the first time Kalen had asked that question. He thought of Elara in the provisioner's office, piecing together the 12% discrepancy from the weight notation systems that nobody else in the lower castle had bothered to learn. He thought of the blank variance columns stretching back 3 years. He thought of 2 warehouses in the eastern foothills, real and confirmed, under a company name that appeared in no official registry. He thought of a girl alone in a dark corridor with a candle and a diary, writing down everything the kingdom refused to see. The session ended. The council filed out. Varick paused beside the king's chair on his way past, a gesture so habitual it barely registered to the others in the room. "I'll have those figures to you within the hour," he said, his voice pitched for the king alone. "Take your time," Kalen said with the tone of a man who had all the time in the world. Varick's eyes held his for just a fraction of a second longer than usual. Then he inclined his head and left. Alone in the council chamber, Kalen sat for a moment in the quiet. The net was in the water. Now it was a question of how long before Varick felt the tension of it, and what he would do when he did. What Varick did, Kalen would learn 48 hours later, was this. He sent Seth to the garrison archive. On the pretense of reviewing Northgate security protocols, a routine audit that would have generated no suspicion under ordinary circumstances, Seth spent 3 hours in the lower garrison records room. What he was looking for, Kalen's observer reported, was documentation, personal documentation. Anything that might connect a garrison guard's daughter to months of unsanctioned surveillance of administrative operations. He didn't find the diary there because the diary was in the king's private study. But he found something else. In the garrison archive, filed under miscellaneous operational notes by a guard who had logged them without understanding their significance, was a set of handwritten observations, dated, careful, precise, in a handwriting that matched the note style of the Eastern route analysis in the diary, documenting wagon departure times and route variations over a 4-month period the previous year. These were Elara's early notes, before she'd started the diary, before she'd understood the full scope of what she was seeing. Seth brought them to Varick. Varick read them. And the following morning, Kalen was in the private study reviewing the warehouse documentation his soldiers had returned with when his personal page, young, reliable, nervous in the way of someone delivering genuinely bad news, appeared at the door and told him that Lord Varick had called an emergency security session with the castle's senior guard command, and that Oren, captain of the North Gate, had been placed on administrative hold pending a security review. Kalen was on his feet before the page finished the sentence. "Which chamber?" he said. "The West Security Room, sire. Lord Varick is, get my captain of the Royal Guard, now. Not Varick's office. Mine. He was already moving. Tell him to meet me at the West Security Room in 5 minutes. He walked the corridor to the West Security Room at a pace that was not quite running but contained all the controlled urgency of it, and the thing that was burning in his chest was not only the strategic calculation of a king recognizing that his case was about to be complicated by his uncle making an unauthorized arrest. It was something sharper than strategy. It was the image of Elara in the courtyard, still and controlled while Seth delivered his warning, her shoulders carrying the weight of 7 days of waiting in the same posture she'd probably been carrying for 8 months, alone, careful, invisible, holding 8 months of truth in her hands with nowhere to put it. Her father. Varric had gone for her father. Kaelin pushed through the door of the West Security Room and found Lord Varric standing at the head of the table with 4 members of the castle guard and Seth at his shoulder, in the process of issuing what appeared to be a formal detainment order. Every person in the room stopped and looked at him. Varric turned. His expression was composed, immediately adjusted to the particular warmth he used for the king. "Sire," he said, "I was about to send word." "What is this?" Kaelin said. "A security matter. Evidence of unsanctioned information gathering by a garrison employee. I'm having the man's quarters reviewed and by whose authority is Orin being held?" Varric paused. "Mine. As Administrative Regent of the Domestic Security Division, under the castle's security charter, section—" "You are not the Domestic Security Regent," Kaelin said. "That position was restructured 2 years ago. Domestic Security answers to my office." The room was very still. "It was a practical matter," Varric said, with the smooth, unflappable confidence of a man who had been the most powerful person in most rooms for 6 years. "A security threat required immediate— Release Orin from administrative hold," Kaelin said. Varric looked at him, held the eye contact with the particular steadiness of a man taking a measurement. "Sire, the security implications of what we've found suggest a pattern of—" "Release him," Kaelin said again, in the voice he used when a repetition was a final statement. The silence in the West Security Room lasted precisely 4 seconds. Then Varric inclined his head, smoothly, graciously, as if he had been intending to comply all along. "Of course," he said. "Pending the formal review." He said it with the tone of a man who was not finished, who was, in fact, only just beginning. And as Kaelin held his uncle's winter sky gaze across the security room table, he understood with complete clarity what the next 48 hours were going to require. There was no longer time to build the case slowly. Whatever Varric had already set in motion, the girl with the diary was at the center of it, and Kaelin was no longer willing to let her face that alone. Elara did not know any of this when she came to find her father that evening and found his post empty. The north gate stood unmanned, which was itself wrong. Her father ran a rotation so tight that the gate had not been without a captain's presence in 4 years. She went first to the garrison duty room, then the officers' quarters, then the records room where he sometimes worked late. Empty. 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 The second watchguard, a barrel-chested man named Rost, who had worked her father's gate for 3 years and had the general quality of someone who preferred his information delivered in small quantities, looked at her when she found him in the outer garrison hall with the specific expression of a man who had been told not to say something and was not comfortable with that instruction. "Rost," she said. "Where is he?" "Administrative review," Rost said to the wall above her head. "Administrative review," she repeated. "Who ordered it?" He didn't answer, which was, she recognized, an answer. "When?" she said. "This afternoon." She stood in the outer garrison hall with the cold coming through the open archway and thought, very clearly and without panic, about what this meant. Varric had found the early notes in the archive. He'd connected them to her. And instead of coming for her, a garrison girl with no standing and no protection, he had gone for the one person in the castle whose loss would hit her hardest and whose detainment she could not simply walk away from. He was using her father as a lever. She turned and walked out of the garrison. She didn't know, yet, where she was going. She only knew that whatever she had been doing for the past 7 days, waiting, working quietly in the margins, trusting that the truth she'd built was in someone else's hands and that those hands might be equal to it, was no longer an option. The lever meant Varric was not going to wait for the king to finish reading. She had to decide right now what she was going to do. Above the castle walls, the night sky was clear and cold, the kind of cold that scoured the air clean and made every star sharp-edged and merciless. The wolves on the ridgeline were quiet tonight. No howl, no signal, just the vast silence of the mountain forest, watching the lights of the castle below with the indifference of something that had existed long before kings and would exist long after. Elara stood in the outer courtyard and breathed the cold air and thought. He has the diary, she thought. He knows. He read it. And either he acts on it or he doesn't, and I cannot wait any longer to find out which. She had spent 8 months building a case for someone else to use. She had spent 7 days hoping. She was done hoping. She turned and looked up at the castle, the high windows of the private wing where lights still burned behind thick glass. Then she straightened her coat, set her jaw, and walked toward the door that would take her to the staircase that would take her to the floor that contained the king's private study. She had gotten into the library once, uninvited and unsanctioned, with a broken latch and a small lantern. This time she was going directly to the door, and this time she was going to knock. She knocked 3 times. The sound of her knuckles against the heavy oak door of the king's private study was quiet, deliberate, and almost certainly the boldest thing she had done in 19 years of living inside a castle that had never once considered her worth paying attention to. The corridor outside the private wing was empty at this hour, past the second watch, not yet at the third. And the only light came from the narrow gaps under the study door and the single wall torch 20 feet behind her. She waited. For a moment she thought he wasn't there, or that whoever was there would open the door and it would be a page or a secretary or someone else entirely who would look at her with the expression people wore when a garrison guard's daughter appeared somewhere she had no business being and ask, in the polite voice that was somehow worse than the rude one, what she wanted. Then the door opened. Kalen was still in his council clothes, minus the formal outer coat, dark tunic, collar undone, a man who had been working rather than sleeping. He held the door with one hand and looked at her with an expression that shifted, in the space of about 2 seconds, from surprise to recognition to something she didn't have an immediate word for. "Elara," he said. "They have my father," she said. She had rehearsed 3 different versions of this conversation on the walk across the castle and had discarded all of them in favor of simply saying the true thing first. "Lord Varick's people put him on administrative hold this afternoon. They found my early notes in the garrison archive. They connected them to me." She held his gaze. "I need to know if you read the diary." A beat. "Come inside," he said. She stepped into the private study, and he closed the door behind her. The study was larger than she'd expected and lived in a way the castle's formal rooms never were. Shelves of working documents rather than decorative volumes. A desk with the particular organized chaos of someone who processed a high volume of information daily. A low fire that had been burning for hours. On the desk, between 2 stacks of documents and a half-empty teacup, lay her diary. She looked at it. He watched her look at it. "Yes," he said, answering the question she hadn't needed to finish asking. "I read it." "All of it?" 3 times. He moved to the desk but didn't sit. Stood beside it, one hand resting on the edge, watching her with that assessment quality she'd noted in the library and now recognized as simply the way he paid attention. The warehouse sites in the eastern foothills. "I sent men 3 days ago. Both locations confirmed." Elara felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't fully realized was clenched. "The warehouses are real," she said, and it came out with more relief than she'd intended. "Stocked, labeled under subsidiary company names that trace back to Crestfall. The falsified records, the weight notation manipulation in the provisioner system, the blank variance columns going back 3 years." He stopped. "You built a complete picture." "I built the best picture I could without access to the original orders or the financial records," she said. "The original documents from Varick's administrative office would be the proof. What I have is circumstantial, strong, detailed circumstantial, but I know," he said. "I'm working on the originals." She looked at him. "How close are you?" 48 hours, maybe less." He said it the way he said everything, without performance, without the particular rounding of hard numbers that people did when they wanted to sound more confident than they were. 48 hours was 48 hours. But Varric moved faster than I expected. Your father's detainment, that wasn't in my timeline. He found the early notes, Elara said. He knows what I've been doing. He doesn't know what I gave you, but he suspects there's more, and he... She stopped, because the next part was the part she'd been working around on her walk across the castle and hadn't wanted to say directly. He's going to move before you're ready. He's not going to wait. Kaelin looked at her for a moment. I know, he said again. This time it was different. Not the brisk acknowledgement of someone running a strategic calculation, but something quieter. The particular tone of a man who had been sitting with an uncomfortable understanding for several hours and had not yet decided what to do with it. Elara looked at the desk, at the diary, at the document stack surrounding it that she now recognized with a rising clarity as the materials he'd been assembling. Cross-referenced, organized, built in the same methodical way she'd built her own case. He hadn't just read the diary, he'd been working from it. Something moved through her that she didn't have a clean name for. Not quite gratitude, not quite the particular relieved fury of being believed after months of working alone. Something with more weight than either of those things. What do you need? She said. He looked at her. The question had clearly not been the one he expected. What? To finish the case before he acts. What do you still need? What he still needed, it turned out, was the original orders. Not copies, not ledger entries, not the reconstructed paper trail that Elara had built from the external evidence. The actual signed orders from Varric's administrative office authorizing the Eastern route diversions. Documents that, if they existed in their original form, would carry Varric's seal and connect the logistical chain directly to his hand rather than to the network of minor administrators he'd used as insulation. Elara knew where they were. She knew because she had spent 3 months, early in her investigation, trying to access them herself, and had ultimately concluded that she couldn't. Not because they were hidden. They weren't, technically. They were filed in Varric's administrative archive, in the east wing of the castle's official records section, a room she had walked past countless times carrying messages for her father. They were filed there because Varric was either confident that no one would look for them specifically, or because they were altered enough that he believed they were safe. The room was accessible from 2 corridors. It was staffed by a senior archivist during the day and locked at night. The lock was a quality mechanism, not the broken latch situation of the library. But there was a service shaft. She had found it 7 months ago, mapped it, and then not used it because the risk of being caught in Varric's own administrative archive was of an entirely different category than the risk of the library. In the library, she was a trespasser. In Varric's archive, in the current climate, she would be a spy. She told the king about the service shaft. He listened without interrupting, which was becoming a quality she found increasingly valuable in a person. The shaft connects to the East Corridor service passage, she said. It's too narrow for a guard's frame, but not for mine. She paused. I can get in. I know the organization system. I've read enough copies of those documents to know how the originals would be filed. If you tell me exactly what signatures I'm looking for... No, he said. She looked at him. Varric's people are already watching you, he said. After today, after the garrison archive, if you go anywhere near the East Wing administrative section, I won't be seen. Elara, I haven't been seen in 8 months, she said, with a flatness that was not defiance but simply a statement of track record. The East Wing service passage connects to 3 different corridors. I know all of them. I know the archivist's lockup routine. I know which documents I'm looking for. She held his gaze. Your soldiers found the warehouses. I gave you the locations. This is the same thing. Kaelin looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man weighing 2 options, neither of which he found satisfactory. If you're found in that archive, he said, I cannot protect you from what Varric will do with it. He has enough right now to brand you an information thief. If you're caught in his archive, he has enough to call you a traitor. The word landed in the room with the particular weight of words that were no longer hypothetical. Then I won't be caught, Elara said. Oh. She went at the 3rd watch, when the castle had reached its deepest quiet. The service shaft was exactly where she remembered it. A maintenance access in the East Corridor wall, behind a storage rack that hadn't been moved in years, and showed it in the undisturbed dust on the floor around its base. She moved the rack with careful, controlled effort, set the lantern on its lowest setting, and pulled herself through the opening. The shaft smelled of old stone and cold metal, and the particular staleness of enclosed spaces that had not had fresh air in a long time. She moved through it on her elbows, the way she'd mapped it in her head 7 months ago, counting the branching points. Left at the second junction, straight through the narrowing at the support beam, right where the shaft angled downward before leveling at the archive floor access. She found the archive access panel in the dark by touch and pressed it open. The administrative archive was cold and absolutely silent. She moved through it with the lantern barely cracked, navigating by the organizational system she'd reconstructed from copies. Varick's archive was meticulous, which was both a quality that made him dangerous and a quality that made him findable. Men who were meticulous with their legitimate records were usually meticulous with their illegitimate ones too, because the habit was the habit. Root authorization orders. Eastern District. Prior 3 years. She found the section in 4 minutes. She found the files in 2 more. She opened the first folder and looked at the top document. The authorization order was exactly what she'd expected. Dates, route specifications, volume allocations, the standard administrative format she'd studied from copies for months. The quantities matched the copies she'd seen. The dates matched the dispatch logs. The signature at the bottom was not Lord Varick's. She stared at it, read it again. The signature, looping, formal, pressed deeply into the paper with the particular weight of a seal ring, was not Varick's administrative seal. It was not any administrative seal she recognized. It was a personal authorization mark, the kind that only 3 people in Iron Hollow carried the authority to use. Members of the royal household. Her lantern hand was not entirely steady as she moved it closer to the document. The signature resolved in the low light. It was the late king's seal, King Aldrich's seal. Aldrich, who had died 6 years ago of a fever that moved too fast and left too few questions asked. Elara crouched on the cold archive floor with the folder open across her knees and looked at the dates on the authorization orders. The first one was dated 14 months before Aldrich's death. The last one was dated 3 weeks after. 3 weeks after. A dead king's seal, used 3 weeks after his death, authorizing supply route diversions that would not have been possible to execute without someone inside the current administrative structure to implement them. She sat with this for 30 seconds. 30 seconds of the specific, cold, reorganizing clarity that came with the kind of discovery that changed the shape of everything that came before it. Varick hadn't built this network after Aldrich died. He had built it with Aldrich's authorization. Whether that authorization had been genuine, whether the late king had been complicit, or whether those documents had been forged, possibly both before and after Aldrich's death, to provide cover for what Varick was doing, she couldn't determine from the documents alone. But the 3 weeks after signature told her something that no other piece of evidence she'd gathered in 8 months had told her. Whoever was managing Aldrich's seal after his death, whoever had access to it, whoever had used it to authorize those final orders, knew the king was dead and chose to use the seal anyway. That was not administrative corruption. That was a conspiracy that began before the current king sat down at his first council session. She took the folder. She took 3 other folders from the same section, the ones whose dates bracketed the critical period, and she put them inside her coat against her chest, and she went back through the service shaft with the particular controlled speed of someone who is not running but has made a very clear decision about what running would mean. What? She was in the east corridor, 10 feet from the service shaft exit, closing the storage rack behind her with steady hands, when she heard the footsteps. Not 1 set. 3. She pressed flat against the wall behind the storage rack, in the shadow between the rack and the corner alcove, and did not breathe. The footsteps came from the south corridor junction. They moved with the unhurried, purposeful quality of men who had been told to go somewhere and were going there. Not a patrol pattern, not a random route. Destination movement. They stopped outside the archive door. Elara heard the sound of a key in the lock. He sent someone to move the documents, she thought, with a clarity that was on the cold side of calm. He knew I would look. Or he suspected someone would after the king asked about the numbers. He sent someone tonight to pull the originals. The archive door opened. She heard the men go inside. She heard 10 seconds later one of them say, The Eastern authorization files are gone. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then a voice she recognized, not Seth, but the man Seth reported to, the senior duty officer who ran Varric's personal security detail, said, "Find her." Elara was already moving. She did not go back to the garrison. That was the first, immediate, non-negotiable calculation. The garrison was the first place they would look, and her father was already being held, which meant that going there would give them both of them in one place and nothing useful besides. She went instead deeper into the castle's lower service passages, the network of maintenance corridors and old utility routes that ran through the building's structure like veins, most of them long since abandoned for any practical purpose and therefore reliably empty. She had known these passages since she was 12. She moved through them in the dark, one hand on the stone wall for guidance, the documents pressed against her chest under her coat, and she thought about what she'd found and what it meant and what the next hour required. The documents needed to reach the king. That was the single, overriding necessity. Everything else, her safety, her father's situation, Varric's men now moving through the castle looking for her, everything else was secondary to getting those folders into Kaelin's hands before they could be recovered or destroyed. She had 3 possible routes to the private wing. One went through the main central corridor, which was now almost certainly covered. One went through the East Servants' staircase, the same route she used to reach the library, which would be covered within minutes if it wasn't already. The third went through the lower kitchen passage, up through the supply delivery route to the castle's inner courtyard, and from there through the garden access to the private wing's ground floor entrance. Longer, more exposure in the inner courtyard, but the route Varric's people would check last, because it was not logical. It was not how someone trying to reach the upper floors would naturally move. She went left at the junction. The inner courtyard at the third watch was cold and open and lit by 2 torches at the far gateway, casting long shadows across the flagstones. She crossed it against the wall, moving in the shadow line, the documents a weight against her ribs that she was beginning to find intensely reassuring. Physical evidence, signed and sealed. The kind of proof that a council chamber could not dismiss. She reached the garden access, pushed through the low iron gate, moved through the formal gardens, bare in winter, their structure reduced to dark geometric lines against the snow, toward the private wing's ground floor entrance. She was 10 feet from the door when a figure stepped out of the shadow at the corner of the wing. She stopped. It was Seth. He was alone, which was strange, and he was not in his usual administrative coat. He was in outdoor gear, cold-weather practical, and his expression in the low light was not the particular smug menace of his courtyard manner. It was something else. Something tighter. "The documents," he said. "Give them to me and walk away. Tonight. Take your father and walk away from the castle, and don't come back." He paused. "That's the offer. It's the only one you're getting." Elara looked at him. "Lord Varric's offer," she said. "It's a good one," Seth said. "Better than what happens otherwise." "What happens otherwise?" "You know what happens otherwise." His voice was flat and even and entirely convincing in its complete absence of drama. This was not a threat being performed for effect. This was information being delivered. "He has your father. He has enough of your writing to call you a spy. He has 2 council members who will support whatever narrative he builds. The king is one man, and he's been at this for a week." He took a step toward her. "Varric has been at this for 6 years. Give me the documents." Elara had thought, on the walk across the courtyard, about what she would do if she was intercepted before she reached the king. She had developed contingencies, routes, arguments, fallback positions, the kind of planning she'd been doing for 8 months in the margins of a life that mostly ignored her. She had not planned on Seth offering her an exit. She stood in the winter garden with the cold coming off the stone in waves and the documents against her chest and looked at Varric's man, and she thought about what leaving would mean. Her father released. No charges. The documents destroyed. The warehouses in the eastern foothills continuing to bleed the outer villages for another 6 years, or 8, or however long it took until there was nothing left to take. The miller girl, dividing bread. "No," she said. Seth looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected this answer and did not find it surprising, only inconvenient. "Then I'm sorry," he said, and he wasn't performing that either. He reached for her arm. Elara twisted away from his grip. Not a large movement, a specific one, the kind she'd learned watching her father run gate security training for 15 years while standing at the courtyard edge and filing it away the way she filed everything. And she ran. Not toward the private wing door, away from it, into the garden, into the geometric dark of the winter borders, toward the far wall and the passage gate at its eastern end, because she had two choices, and one of them had just closed. She heard Seth behind her. One set of footsteps, then two, then three. He hadn't been alone after all. He'd been the front. She hit the passage gate at full speed, shoved it open, ran into the outer passage beyond it, and turned immediately left because left was toward the central tower, and the central tower had 3 floors up, accessible from the main staircase, accessible from the staircase she was now running toward, the council chamber, which at this hour would be empty, which had, mounted behind the Alpha's council seat, the kingdom's emergency petition seal, the seal that, once broken, legally mandated a full council assembly within the hour. No administrative discretion, no regent's override. A mandatory assembly that every council member, including the king, was required by charter to attend. She had read about it in the archive records. She had thought about it once, in an early diary entry, and then dismissed it as wildly impractical. She was no longer being practical. She was running. The staircase was clear. The 3rd floor corridor was clear. The council chamber door was locked, but the council chamber, unlike the library, had no broken latch and no service shaft. It had a lock that her small garrison tools would not touch in the time she had. She stood outside the council chamber door with 3 men's footsteps on the stairs below her, close, getting closer, and looked at the door and thought at absolute maximum speed. The petition seal was inside. She couldn't get inside. What she could get, what was right there mounted to the wall at the end of the council corridor, used for signaling emergency assembly of the castle guard, was the emergency bell. She had never heard it rung. She was fairly certain no one alive in the castle had heard it rung. She ran to the end of the corridor. The bell was iron, old, mounted on a bracket with a pull rope that had probably not been touched in 20 years. She grabbed the rope with both hands. She pulled. The sound that exploded through the castle was nothing like a normal bell. It was vast and deep and furious, the sound of iron that had been waiting 20 years for this exact moment, rolling through stone walls and flagstone floors and oak beams, and all the way down to the garrison and the stables and the outer walls, shaking the cold air in every corridor, waking every sleeping person in Iron Hollow Castle with the specific, unmistakable, centuries-old signal that meant crisis. Assembly. Now. The footsteps on the staircase stopped. Elara stood at the end of the council corridor with the pull rope still in both hands, her heart slamming, her breath visible in the cold air, the document still pressed against her chest, the bell still ringing in rolling waves above her. She heard shouting from multiple directions. The garrison, the guard stations, the residential wing. She heard doors. She heard boots on multiple staircases simultaneously. And she heard from the staircase directly below her a voice she had not heard since the private study. Stand down. Quiet. Absolute. The voice of a man who expected to be obeyed. A pause. Then the sound of Seth's men stopping. Then Kaelin was at the top of the staircase, not in council clothes this time. The dark, practical gear of a man who had been awake and had heard the bell and had already been moving. Behind him were 2 members of his personal royal guard. He looked at the men on the stairs, then at her. She held out the documents. "Varric used your father's seal," she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. "After he died. Authorization order signed with King Aldrich's seal, dated after the death. The originals. I have 3 years of them." She held the folders out further. "It's not administrative corruption. It's been a conspiracy from the beginning." Kaelin didn't move for a full 2 seconds. Then he crossed the corridor in 5 strides and took the folders from her hands, opened the top one, and looked at the first document. She watched his face. The neutral expression, the controlled, careful neutrality she had learned to read from a courtyard distance, fractured for exactly 3 seconds. She saw it happen, the precise moment when the shape of 6 years rearranged itself behind his eyes into something he had not been prepared for, something that landed harder than confirmation of corruption because it reached further back into grief as well as betrayal. Then he closed the folder. "You rang the emergency bell," he said. "You're required by charter to assemble the council within the hour," she said. "So is everyone else. He can't block it. He can't dismiss it. He has to come to the room." The corner of his jaw was tight. His eyes were on her face with an intensity that was different from the assessment quality, different from anything she'd seen there before. "You were running from his men," he said. "I was faster," she said. "Elara, the council is assembling," she said. "We have less than an hour. Whatever you still need from me, whatever I can tell them, I need to know what the plan is, because I rang that bell and I'm standing in the council corridor at 3 a.m. with your uncle's men on the staircase and I have run out of ways to be invisible." Kalen looked at her for one more second. Then he handed the folders to the senior royal guard beside him, issued 3 orders in rapid succession, 2 to the guard, 1 to the soldier behind him, and turned back to her with the expression of a man who had reached a decision and was done with the deliberation. "Stay beside me," he said, "from this moment. Don't go anywhere without my guard." "My father, I'm releasing him in the next 10 minutes. He'll be brought to the council chamber." He looked at her steadily. "You said you ran out of ways to be invisible." "Good, because what happens in the next hour requires you to be extremely visible." A pause. "Can you do that?" She thought about 8 months of dark corridors and hidden lanterns and careful, patient, invisible work. She thought about the Miller girl, the blank variance columns, the dead king's seal pressed into paper 3 weeks after the man who owned it stopped breathing. "Yes," she said. In the floors below, the castle was alive with light and movement, and the gathering noise of an emergency assembly answering a bell that hadn't rung in 20 years. Doors were opening, boots were moving. Council members, roused from sleep, were pulling on formal coats and moving toward the chamber with the particular confusion of people who had been woken by a sound their bodies recognized as urgent before their minds caught up. Lord Varick would be among them. He would arrive at the council chamber with no warning, no preparation, no time to construct the narrative he would have built for a scheduled confrontation. He would walk into a room with the king already there, with an emergency assembly already seated, with 3 years of original authorization documents in the hands of the royal guard. He would walk in not knowing what she'd found. Elara straightened her coat. She tucked the last loose strand of hair back from her face. She looked at the king of Iron Hollow standing in the cold council corridor, with an emergency assembly convening below them and a conspiracy 6 years in the making finally visible in the light. "Ready?" he said. She had been ready for 8 months. "Let's go," she said. They walked down the stairs together toward the sound of the assembling council. And the moment that the longest, most patient, most dangerous 8 months of Elara's life had been building toward arrived not as a dramatic explosion, but as the particular, irreversible motion of a door opening and truth walking through it, and there being no way left for the dark to close around it again. Below them, Lord Varick was already in the corridor. He looked up. He saw her face. He saw what was in the royal guard's hands, and for the first time in 6 years, the most powerful man in Iron Hollow Castle looked like a man who understood, completely and too late, that the invisible girl had been watching him the whole time. Varick's face, in the moment he understood, was a lesson in the specific architecture of a man whose carefully constructed world had just developed a crack he could not immediately calculate his way around. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then the expression closed. Smooth, practiced, the winter sky eyes resettling into their habitual warmth. And Lord Varick continued down the corridor toward the council chamber with the unhurried confidence of a man who had spent 6 years ensuring that whatever room he walked into as the most prepared person in it. Elara watched him do it and felt, for the first time in 8 months, something that was not quite fear. It was closer to certainty. She had documented a pattern for 8 months. She had found the original proof tonight. And she had just watched the most dangerous administrator in Iron Hollow Castle look at the evidence in the royal guard's hands and make the instantaneous calculation that he could still manage this, that he could walk into an emergency assembly at 3 in the morning without preparation and talk his way through it. That calculation, she understood with cold clarity, was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. The council chamber at the third watch, assembled under emergency bell, was nothing like the council chamber in its daytime administrative sessions. The daytime sessions had the particular quality of managed ritual, members arriving in order, taking their customary positions, settling into the familiar patterns of a meeting whose outcome was generally determined before anyone sat down. Comfortable. Controlled. Varick's natural environment. This was different. 12 council members had assembled in varying states of emergency dress, most of them awake but not yet fully collected, seated in positions that reflected the order they'd arrived rather than their customary hierarchy. The chamber smelled of cold air and hastily lit candles. 2 members were still pulling on their formal coats as they sat. The steward general had arrived without his chain of office and looked deeply uncomfortable about it. The king's chair was empty. Varick took his customary seat, 2 positions to the left of center, with the composure of a man who had decided his strategy on the walk down the corridor and was executing it. He greeted the council members on either side of him quietly, the warm authority voice perfectly calibrated, a man arriving at an unexpected meeting he had every right to be at. He had not looked at Elara again since the corridor. She was standing at the chamber's rear wall, beside Kaelin's senior royal guard, holding nothing. The folders were in the guard's hands. Her job, for the next few minutes, was to be present and say nothing until she was asked to speak. A role she was, Kaelin had noted with a brevity that might have been dry humor under other circumstances, presumably familiar with. The chamber doors opened. Kaelin walked in. He walked in the way he moved through the training yard, not performing, not announcing, simply occupying the space he occupied with the total, unpretentious authority of someone who understood exactly what they were. He went to the Alpha's chair, stood beside it rather than sitting, and looked around the table at the assembled council with an expression that was not the customary administrative attention of a king opening a routine session. Every person in the room felt the difference. "Thank you for assembling," he said. His voice carried without effort. "I know the hour is unusual. The matter is not." He let a single beat pass. "This session is being called under the emergency charter provision, which means the record is official, the assembly is complete, and all decisions made in this chamber tonight are binding without review." He looked at the steward general. "Is that acknowledged?" The steward general, who was a careful, somewhat nervous man who took his procedural responsibilities with the dedication of someone for whom procedure was a comfort, straightened in his seat. "Acknowledged, sire. Emergency assembly confirmed under Charter Provision 7, Section." "Thank you," Kaelin said. He sat down. "Lord Varick." Varick met his eyes across the table with perfect equanimity. "Sire, I have questions about the Eastern Supply Administration. I'd like to ask them in front of the full council." He paused. "I think you'd prefer that too." The specific quality of that last sentence, the way it landed in the room as something other than a courtesy, produced a fractional shift in the attention of every council member present. Not alarm, not understanding, just the particular alertness of experienced political operators sensing a change in atmospheric pressure. "Of course," Varick said. He folded his hands on the table, composed, prepared, patient, the picture of a man with nothing to hide. Shit. What followed was not the dramatic, immediate confrontation that Elara had, in the most anxious versions of her imagining, pictured. Kaelin did not open with the documents. He did not announce the warehouses or the forged seals or 3 years of falsified records. He began instead with questions. Specific, detailed, unhurried questions about the Eastern Route authorization process, the variance reporting structure, the weight notation systems, the administrative chain between provisioner and district office, and Varick's review authority. He asked the questions the way Elara had taught him to ask questions, without knowing that was what she'd done. Don't ask what you want to know. Ask something nearby. Varick answered, competently, smoothly, with the practiced fluency of a man who had been answering administrative questions for 6 years and knew every expected follow-up before it arrived. He was good. Elara, watching from the rear wall, recognized how good he was with the particular appreciation of someone who had spent months studying the architecture of his method. The way he kept answers just specific enough to sound authoritative, and just general enough to avoid committing to verifiable details. The way he used the council members' unfamiliarity with the technical specifics as a buffer. She watched 2 of the council members nodding along. She watched 3 others watching Varric with the slightly glazed attention of people who had been woken before dawn for a technical administrative discussion they did not entirely follow. She felt the particular cold that came with understanding that the truth, presented in the wrong way, could still lose. Then Kaelin said, "Walk me through the authorization for the eastern route diversions of 3 years ago, specifically the Crestfall subsidiary orders." The room didn't change, the candles didn't flicker, Varric's expression didn't move, but something in the air shifted. "Routine supply optimization," Varric said. "The eastern routes were realigned for efficiency following the road infrastructure assessment. Standard administrative." "Who authorized the volume diversions?" Kaelin said. "My office, in coordination with the provisioner." "Under whose seal?" "A beat. Half a beat. Less than that. But it existed, and Elara saw 2 of the sharpest council members register it. "My administrative seal," Varric said, "as regent for domestic operations." "I have the original orders," Kaelin said. He nodded to the royal guard at the rear wall. The guard walked forward and placed the folders on the table in front of the steward general. "The seals on those documents," Kaelin said, "are not Lord Varric's administrative seal. They are King Aldric's personal authorization seal." He let the room sit with that for 2 full seconds. "The dates on those orders include 3 signed after my father's death." The council chamber went very still. Not the polite stillness of people managing their reactions. The genuine stillness of 12 people whose understanding of the past 6 years had just been asked to reorganize around a piece of information that changed the shape of everything before it. The steward general opened the top folder, looked at the document, looked at the seal, looked at the date, looked at the seal again. "This is," he started, stopped. "This seal is Aldric's," said the council member to his left, an older woman named Councillor Marin, who had served since the previous reign and had the particular stillness of someone who was very, very controlled in moments of genuine shock. She looked at the date. "This date is 17 days after the funeral." 23 days, said the steward general, in a voice that had lost some of its procedural steadiness. "The state funeral was on the—" "I know when my father's funeral was," Kaelin said. Silence. Varric had not moved, had not changed expression, had not reached for the documents or looked away from the king or done any of the things a guilty man might do in the movies of Elara's imagination. He sat with his hands folded on the table and his winter sky eyes on Kaelin's face and said nothing, which was either the behavior of an innocent man waiting for an accusation to be disproven or the behavior of an extraordinarily experienced operator waiting to see the full shape of the evidence before deciding which piece to pull. "Lord Varric," the king said, "whose hand used my father's seal on those documents?" "I would need to review the documents," Varric said. His voice was even. "Before commenting on their provenance." "You have been the custodian of the royal household seals since my father's death," Kaelin said. "As regent, as the senior member of the household, you have been the only person with authorized access to the late king's personal effects, including his seal ring, for 6 years. A pause. "Who else could have used it?" "Seals can be copied," Varric said. "Documents can be forged. I would suggest that before this council entertains the extraordinary implication of what you're describing, the provenance of these documents," and here his voice shifted almost imperceptibly toward the specific register he used to redirect conversations, "and their source should be examined. These were not obtained through official channels." He looked at the back of the room. He looked at Elara. "They were obtained by an unauthorized individual with a documented history of unsanctioned access to restricted areas," he said. "A garrison guard's daughter who has been conducting what amounts to a personal surveillance operation against this administration for the better part of a year. Before this council accepts those documents as evidence, I would ask, what is the chain of custody? Who is this person, and what is her agenda?" And there it was, clean, precise, and arrived at exactly the moment she'd expected it to arrive. Elara had thought about this on the walk down the stairs. She was ready. Lord Varick is correct, she said from the back wall. Every head in the council chamber turned toward her. 12 council members, a steward general, the Alpha King, and Lord Varick himself, all looking at a 19-year-old garrison guard's daughter standing against the rear wall in a coat that had stone dust on the elbows from a service shaft she had crawled through 40 minutes ago. I obtained those documents without official authorization, she said. Her voice was steady. She had her father's practicality and her mother's stubbornness and 8 months of practice speaking truth into silence. I accessed Lord Varick's administrative archive through a service maintenance shaft at the third watch tonight. That is trespassing, and I acknowledge it. She looked at Varick. The documents are genuine. The method of obtaining them was unauthorized. Both of those things are true. Varick's expression, for the first time, contained something that was not quite as controlled as everything else he'd shown tonight. She continued before he could redirect. I've been documenting the Eastern supply diversions for 8 months, she said. I have dated records of wagon departure anomalies, provisioner ledger discrepancies, the weight notation manipulation that created the 12% Eastern allocation gap, and the consistent suppression of variance data in the quarterly district reports before they left Lord Varick's administrative office. She looked at the council. Those records are in the King's study. They predate my access to this archive by 7 months. They were built from publicly accessible administrative documents that I obtained legitimately through my work in the Garrison Records Office. She paused. The documents from the archive tonight confirm what those 8 months of records point toward. I didn't go into that archive to build a case. I went in to find the proof that the case I had already built was pointing at. She looked at Varick directly. My agenda is that the outer villages have been systematically starved for 3 years while the grain meant for them was being sold through a private company network for private profit. My agenda is that children in the eastern districts have been going hungry, while the variance numbers that would have flagged this were being blanked from the quarterly reports. She stopped. That's my agenda. The council chamber was quiet with a different quality than before. Not the stillness of shock or the stillness of political caution. Something more active. The particular attention of people who were listening. Really listening, some of them for what might have been the first time all night. Councillor Marin was looking at her with an expression Elara could not categorize, but that contained no dismissal. The steward general was looking at the documents in front of him with the expression of a man doing very fast arithmetic in his head. The documents, Kalin said, addressing the steward general, can be verified against the Royal Seal Registry. The registry is in the Vault Archive. It has been sealed since my father's death and has not been accessed under my reign. He looked at Marin. I'm asking you to lead the verification, Counselor. Now, tonight, before this assembly closes. Marin stood. I'll need 2 witnesses from the council. 2 members stood without being asked. Varick spoke. Sire, a verification process conducted under these circumstances. Lord Varick, the king's voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. You will remain in this chamber until the verification is complete. That is not a request. For the first time, something crossed Varick's face that was not calculation. It lasted 1 second. Then it was gone. But Elara had seen it. She thought of what she'd written in the early entries. He's the kind of man who only panics alone, never in public, because public panic is a resource he doesn't give away. She had written that 7 months ago, working from observation and instinct. She had not known then how precisely it would apply to this exact moment. She filed it away anyway. Some habits were permanent. The verification took 47 minutes. Elara spent them standing against the rear wall of the council chamber, which was better than sitting because standing allowed the specific quality of controlled stillness that she was currently using as a management strategy for the several things happening in her body simultaneously. The adrenaline come down from the service shaft and the garden run and the bell rope and the corridor confrontation, the specific sustained tension of 47 minutes in a room with Lord Varick present and unresolved, and underneath both of those, something she was categorically refusing to examine right now, which involved the King of Iron Hollow looking at her across a council chamber and saying, "Stay beside me," in a voice that had been doing something counterproductive to her concentration for the better part of an hour. Not the moment. Absolutely not the moment. Her father arrived 20 minutes in, escorted by one of Kaylin's personal guard. He came through the chamber door in his captain's coat, not his formal dress, just his working uniform, which meant they'd pulled him from administrative hold rather than proper quarters, and scanned the room with the calm, assessing attention of a man who had been told very little and was making up the difference with observation. He found her face across the chamber. She gave him the small, specific nod that meant, "I'm all right, and I'll explain later." He gave her the look that meant, "We will be having a very long conversation," and took the position the guard indicated at the side wall, and said nothing, because Oren understood rooms the way his daughter understood rooms, by reading them rather than announcing himself into them. At the 30-minute mark, two of the council members who had been nodding along with Varric's answers had stopped looking at him. At the 40-minute mark, the third council member who had initially seemed inclined toward Varric's version of events, a heavy-set trade administrator named Councillor Bren, who had served on the Eastern District Oversight for 4 years, was reading the provisioner documents that had been passed around the table with an expression that was moving steadily away from skepticism and toward something Elara recognized as the particular discomfort of a man who was recalculating what he should have noticed and when. At 47 minutes, Councillor Marin came back through the chamber doors with her 2 witnesses. She walked to the head of the table, placed the verification record in front of the Steward General, and looked at the king. "The Royal Seal Registry confirms the seal on the documents as authentic," she said. "King Aldrich's personal authorization seal. The registry records show no authorized use of the seal after the date of death." She paused, and in the pause was the weight of what came next. "The 3 post-death authorizations in those documents are not registered, which means they were either used without authorization from the registry," she stopped, "or the registry was not updated to reflect their use." "Who controls registry updates?" Kaylin asked. Every person in the room already knew the answer. Marin said it anyway because the record required it. "The Regent for Household Administration," she said, "for the past 6 years. Lord Varric." What followed was not chaos. It was almost worse than chaos. It was the specific, terrible orderliness of a room full of careful political people processing a catastrophic revelation in real time, each one making calculations about what they had known, what they had not known, what they should have known, and what their position required them to do next. Varric made one more move. She had expected him to. Men who had operated at his level for 6 years did not go quiet when the room turned. They adapted, they reframed, they found the angle that gave them ground to work from. "What we have," he said, addressing the council with the particular deliberate calm of a man managing a flood with a bucket, "is an irregularity in the registry that requires investigation. I am not above scrutiny. No one in this room is. But what I will not accept, in front of this council, is the implication that documents obtained illegally by an individual with a demonstrable personal motive against my administration should be treated as conclusive proof of personal motive," Elara said. She hadn't planned to speak again. It came out before she finished deciding to say it. Varric stopped, looked at her with the expression of a man for whom interruption was both unexpected and informative. "You've said that twice," she said. "Personal motive. As if the reason I documented what I documented was something personal between me and your supply chain." She was aware of the entire chamber watching her, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was no longer managing the awareness. She was simply inside it, the way you were inside weather. "My motive was the eastern villages, the same ones your supply diversions have been systematically underfunding for 3 years. I don't know you. I've never spoken to you before tonight. I have no personal anything." She held his gaze. "I have a diary. I have 8 months of dated records, and I have the proof you just heard verified by this council's own review." She paused. "That's not a motive. That's a method." The silence in the chamber had a quality she had not heard before, and did not have an existing word for. Councillor Marin was looking at her with an expression that had completed its movement away from anything resembling dismissal, and arrived somewhere that looked almost like recognition. The particular recognition of a woman who had spent decades in a council chamber watching power manage itself, seeing something that operated on a different principle. Councillor Bren had stopped reading the provisioner documents and was looking at Varric. The steward general had his hands flat on the table and was looking at the verification record. And Lord Varick, silver-haired, winter sky-eyed, 6 years of absolute administrative authority radiating from every practiced line of him, looked at Elara for a long moment with an expression that was, for the first time all evening, entirely unmanaged. Not rage, not fear. Something more considered than either. The look of a man who had, in the architecture of his calculation, genuinely not accounted for her. He had known about the girl with the notes. He had tracked the early records. He had sent Seth to warn her, had tried to use her father as leverage, had prepared the traitor narrative and the unauthorized access argument and the personal motive framing. He had prepared for a document-based confrontation and an emergency assembly and a king who had found the warehouses. He had not prepared for her to stand at the back of the council chamber and talk, not because he'd underestimated her intelligence, because he had, at the most fundamental level, not believed that a garrison guard's daughter with no title and no standing would still be standing. Kaelin had been watching her. He looked now at Varick. "Lord Varick," he said in a voice that had finalized, "I am invoking Alpha authority to suspend your administrative access, pending a full council investigation." He looked at the steward general. "I want a complete audit of the Eastern administrative records going back 6 years. I want the financial records of the Crestfall Trading Company and all subsidiary names submitted by my investigators within 72 hours. He looked at the 2 royal guards at the chamber doors. "Lord Varick is to be escorted to the East residence and remain there under guard until the investigation is complete." Varick stood. He straightened his coat. He looked at the council. 12 faces that had, over the past 47 minutes, shifted in the specific, irreversible way of people who have seen something they cannot unsee. He did not look at Elara again. He walked out of the council chamber between the royal guards with the composure of a man who had not yet finished fighting, because men like Varick never finished, not all at once, not in a single room. And the chamber doors closed behind him, and the sound they made was the particular sound of a season ending. Thubbed. In the silence that followed, no one spoke for nearly 30 seconds. Then Councillor Marin looked across the chamber at Elara and said, in the voice she used when she was being precise rather than diplomatic, "How long did you say you've been documenting this?" 8 months, Elara said. "Alone?" "Yes." Marin looked at her for another moment. Then she looked at the king. Then she looked back at the documents on the table in front of the steward general. The provisioner records, the warehouse confirmations, the Eastern route analysis, the original authorization orders with the dead king's seal pressed into them like an accusation across time. 8 months, Marin said again, in the tone of someone doing arithmetic with that number and arriving at an uncomfortable result. "And you brought all of this," she gestured at the table, "through a service shaft." "The lock on the archive door was quality," Elara said. Something happened at the corner of Marin's mouth, not quite a smile. The controlled, almost smile of a woman who had been in council politics for 30 years and found, occasionally, something that surprised her. "The eastern villages," Marin said. "The outer districts. What's the current situation, from your records?" Elara told her. She told her about the Miller family and the systematic 12% allocation gap and the blank variance columns and the 4-month provision shortfall in the outer 7 districts. She told her in the same voice she wrote in, specific, dated, sourced, no performance. Just the information, in the order that made its shape most visible. She was aware, distantly, of the rest of the council listening. She was aware of her father at the side wall, standing with his hands clasped behind him, and the expression of a man who was revising something he thought he knew about his daughter upward by a significant margin. She was aware of Kaelin. He was sitting at the Alpha's chair at the head of the council table, and he was not looking at the documents, or the counselors, or the verification record. He was looking at her, and the quality of his attention had shifted from everything she'd seen from him before. Not assessment, not the strategic attention of a king managing a crisis. Something quieter. Something that had nothing to do with the council chamber or the emergency assembly or the 6 years of corruption being disassembled at the table between them. She looked back at him for exactly 1 second. Then she looked at Councillor Marin and kept talking, because there were 7 outer districts and 4 months of shortfall and a room full of people who were, for the first time, actually listening. "Innam," The assembly formally closed 2 hours before dawn. The investigation into Lord Varick and the Crestfall network was officially opened, with Councillor Marin as lead, a choice Kaelin had made quietly and Marin had accepted with the nod of a woman who had been waiting for a reason to look at the Eastern administration for longer than she'd said publicly. The Eastern District shortfalls were flagged for immediate emergency provisioning from the Central Reserve. The warehouses in the foothills were to be seized and inventoried within 48 hours. Oren was formally cleared of the administrative hold before the assembly closed. He stood beside Elara afterward in the corridor outside the chamber, the castle beginning its pre-dawn stirring around them, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he put his hand on the back of her head briefly, the way he'd done when she was small, and said, 8 months. I know, she said. You should have told me. I know. Another silence. Then, the Miller family, in the outer village. I know where they are, she said. When the provisioning order goes through, we'll make sure it reaches them, he said. Personally. She nodded. He looked at her for a moment with the specific expression she recognized as pride, carefully managed by a man who found large emotions uncomfortable in corridors. Your mother, he said, would have done the same thing. He said it quietly, and then walked away down the corridor, which was how Oren handled the things he felt most. And Elara stood alone for a moment in the early morning cold and let it land somewhere it could stay. She heard footsteps behind her. She recognized the weight of them. Had been recognizing them, she realized, for weeks, from distances she had no business identifying. She turned. Kaelin stopped 2 feet from her. He was still in the practical dark gear from earlier, and he looked like a man who had been awake for 20-some hours and was currently running on the specific fuel of things that weren't finished yet. You should sleep, he said. So should you, she said. I have 3 hours of investigative orders to draft before the morning watch. I know. I have the provisioner amendment to cross-reference with the district shortfall records so the emergency supply orders don't repeat the weight notation error. She paused. I can do that in 2 hours if I start now. He looked at her. You're not an administrative employee, he said. I know. She met his eyes. Do you want the shortfall records accurately corrected or not? A beat. Then, with the quality of a man making a decision that he recognized as one kind of crossing and was making anyway. Come to the study. They walked down the corridor together in the early morning dark, the castle settling into the particular dense quiet of the hour before dawn, and neither of them spoke. And the silence had none of the tension of the council chamber and none of the careful management of everything that had come before. It was just 2 people walking in the same direction. Which was, Elara thought, a different thing than it had been this time yesterday. A fundamentally, irrevocably different thing. Behind them, the council chamber sat empty, its candles burning low. The verification record and the original authorization documents and 8 months of a garrison girl's careful, furious, patient truth spread across the table where 12 people had read them and believed them. The provisional orders had gone out. The investigation was open. The most powerful man in Iron Hollow had walked out of that chamber between 2 guards, and the documents that had convicted him had been written in a hand that was still slightly smudged with service shaft dust on the elbows. Somewhere in the outer eastern districts, the sun was coming up on a morning that was not, yet, fixed. The damage was real, and the rebuilding was slow, and there were 4 months of shortfall to address, and 7 districts to reach, and a winter that was not finished with any of them. But the blank variance column at last would be filled, and the girl who had spent 8 months writing truth into the dark had walked out of the council chamber in the company of the Alpha King, and every person in that room had watched her do it, and not one of them, not even the ones who had been nodding along with Varick's answers an hour before, had looked away. It was not the end. But it was the first morning in 8 months that felt like something other than waiting. The first morning felt like something other than waiting, and then the work began. Not the dramatic, singular work of a council chamber at 3 a.m. with documents spread across a table and 12 people watching the shape of 6 years rearrange itself. The other work. The slower, harder, less visible kind. The kind that happened in the daylight hours after the emergency assembly closed, and the guards took their positions outside the east residence, and the council filed out into a castle that looked the same as it always had, but was not the same and would not be again. Elara spent the first 3 days in Kaylin's study, not continuously. She slept in the garrison quarters in the same narrow cot, because the garrison was still her home, and she was not yet sure what anything else meant. But she was in the study by the time the morning watch changed, and she stayed until the candles burned low, working through the Eastern District records with the methodical precision she had applied to everything for 8 months. Except now there was a desk and proper light and access to original documents, and someone across the room who asked questions that were worth answering. The weight notation corrections alone took the better part of a day. The 12% allocation gap, multiplied across 3 years and 7 outer districts, resolved into a number that made Councillor Marin, when she reviewed it, go very quiet for a long time before she said anything. "This is the full scope," Elara told her on the second day, spreading the corrected calculations across the study table. "I've cross-referenced with the seasonal variance data and the outer district population records. The actual shortfall, what should have been delivered and wasn't, is approximately 4 times what the blank variance columns would have suggested." Marin looked at the numbers. 4 times. The weight notation manipulation compounded the discrepancy in the quarterly totals. Every report that went to the Oversight Committee was built on numbers that were already wrong before the variance was suppressed. Elara paused. No one on the Oversight Committee was working from accurate baseline data. The error was introduced upstream at the notation level before the reports were generated. "So the committee couldn't have caught it," Marin said, "without knowing to look for the notation manipulation specifically." "Not easily, not without someone who had read the old provisioner notation guides." A pause. "They're in the garrison archive. Nobody requests them. I found them because I was bored at 16 and read everything in the archive that seemed like it might be useful someday." Marin looked at her with the expression that had been evolving over the past 2 days from the almost smile of the council chamber into something that resembled genuine, considered regard. "Where did you learn to build an evidentiary case?" she asked. Elara thought about it honestly. "I didn't learn it as a case," she said. "I just wrote down what I saw, with the date and the source, because I thought if I didn't, I'd forget the specifics, and the specifics are what make the difference between a pattern and a suspicion." She paused. "My father taught me that you have to be able to say exactly when and where and what, or the person you're talking to can always find a gap to doubt." "Your father taught you that?" "He was teaching me about gate security logs," she said. "It transfers." "What?" The investigation moved faster than Varric had expected it to. She could tell, from the reports that came back through the council structure over the first week, that his strategy had been built on the assumption that it would move slowly, that the scale of what he'd built, the number of subsidiary layers and administrative buffers, would give him time to work the council relationships he'd spent 6 years cultivating. He had not accounted for Marin working 18-hour days. He had not accounted for the 3 junior administrators in his own office who, faced with the specific reality of investigators with original documents and full investigative authority, revised their understanding of where their institutional loyalty was best placed, and began cooperating with a speed that suggested they had been waiting for exactly this opening for longer than anyone had previously known. He had especially not accounted for the fact that Elara's 8 months of external documentation gave the investigators a map. Every warehouse, every subsidiary name, every administrative chain she had traced from the outside, the investigators could now trace from the inside, following her path in reverse, and what they found at each point confirmed and extended what she had built. On the 6th day, the financial records came in. The money trail from the Crestfall network led, through 4 subsidiary companies and 2 intermediary accounts in a merchant banking house in the southern city, to a private holdings account that had been active for 7 years. The account was in Varric's name. On the 7th day, the investigators found the seal ring. It was in the false bottom of a document case in Varric's private study in the East residence, the kind of hiding place that worked against a cursory search and failed completely against investigators who were looking specifically and had all the time they needed. The ring was King Aldrich's personal seal, the one that had been listed as lost in the days after the king's death, logged in the household inventory as missing and presumed taken with the body for burial. It had not been buried. It had been kept. Elara was in the study when the report came in. She read it at the corner of the desk she had been occupying for 6 days and sat with it for a long moment, thinking about what it meant. Not just for the investigation, but for the question she had not been able to answer when she first found the post-death authorization orders. Whether the seal had been used with Aldrich's knowledge, whether the late king had been complicit, or whether something else had happened in the final weeks of his reign. The ring, kept and hidden for 6 years, answered that question. You didn't hide evidence of a consensual arrangement. She looked up. Kaelin was at the main desk, reviewing the border security reports that had been accumulating during the week she'd occupied his study. She had learned, over 6 days, to read his silences, the different qualities of them, the working silence and the thinking silence and the specific silence he used when he was managing something he hadn't decided how to carry yet. This was the last one. She said quietly, "He found the ring." Kaelin didn't look up immediately. He finished the line he was reading. Then he set the report down and looked at the document she was holding. She brought it to his desk and placed it in front of him. He read it once more. Placed it on the desk with the particular care of someone handling something that was both evidence and grief simultaneously. The thing that confirmed the corruption and also confirmed that his father had not chosen it. That Aldrich had not known. That whatever Varric had done, he had done to a king who trusted him in the years before that king's son took the throne. He kept it, Kaelin said. It was not a question. Yes. A silence. Then, he kept it because he needed it, for future use, in case the existing orders needed to be extended or the authorization trail needed to be reinforced. He paused. He kept my father's seal as a tool. Elara said nothing because there was nothing useful to add to that, and some things deserved to be said without a response. After a moment, Kaelin reached out and turned the report face down on the desk. "Thank you," he said, and then, more quietly, "for the other thing, what you wrote, about his death." He did not look at her. In the diary, the entry about the fever. She had written, in month 4, a careful, tentative, thoroughly sourced entry about the late king's illness, the speed of it, the unusual progression, the specific attending physician who had retired to the outer provinces 6 months after Aldrich's death and had not been reachable since. She had framed it as a question rather than a conclusion because she hadn't had the evidence to make it a conclusion. She had written, "I don't know what this means. I'm not sure I want to know. But I wrote it down because not writing it felt like a different kind of failure." She had not expected him to bring it up. "I wasn't sure," she said. "I'm still not sure. The investigators would need to—" "They're looking," he said. "The physician, the attending records." He paused. "We may not find answers, but we'll look." He finally turned and met her eyes. "Because of what you wrote. Because you wrote it when it would have been easier not to." She held his gaze and felt, in the specific quality of that moment, something shift in the structure of the past 8 months. Not a resolution, not an ending, but a recognition. The particular recognition that comes when the thing you did alone, in the dark, believing no one was watching, turns out to have been witnessed after all. Not by anyone you expected, not in any way you planned, but witnessed. Amas. The formal council session to finalize Varric's charges and removal was held on the 12th day. It was not at 3 in the morning. It was midday, in the full council chamber with all 16 members present, sunlight coming through the tall windows for the first time in weeks. The weather had broken on the 10th day, as if the kingdom itself had been waiting, and the formal record being taken by 3 separate scribes. Elara sat in the gallery. She had been given a seat in the gallery by Kaelin's office, which had produced a council gallery pass with her name on it, which had in turn produced a particular expression on the face of the gallery steward. Not quite disbelief, not quite offense, but the specific quality of a man whose expectation of the world was being revised in real time in a way he found mildly unsettling. She had taken the seat. She had looked at the council chamber from the gallery and felt the difference between this view and the rear wall of the emergency assembly 12 days ago, and found she didn't have a clean word for it. The session was long and thorough and largely procedural in its structure, because the evidence was complete and the council had been reviewing it for 12 days, and there were no meaningful arguments left to be made against it. Varick's counsel, a senior legal administrator who had taken the case with the specific expression of a man who knew exactly what the evidence showed and was performing professional obligation rather than genuine advocacy, presented the formal responses to each charge. The charges were systematic misappropriation of royal supply allocations across a 6-year period, unauthorized use of the late king's personal seal after his death, falsification of administrative records, creation of fraudulent company structures for private financial gain, conspiracy to defraud the royal household and the people of the outer eastern districts. The council voted on each charge individually. Every vote was unanimous. When the final vote was recorded and the Steward General announced the result, Varick, stripped of all titles, properties, and administrative positions, formally banished from Iron Hollow and its territories, his assets seized for redistribution to the Eastern District Restoration Fund. The council chamber was quiet in the way of rooms where something definitive has just occurred. Varick was not present. He had been given the choice of attending or receiving the verdict in the East residence, and he had chosen the residence with the particular dignity of a man who understood that some endings were better not witnessed in person. But the rest of the council was present, and in the gallery, Elara watched the vote come in, clean and complete and final, and thought about the Miller girl and the blank variance columns, and a wagon leaving 3 hours before its listed departure time on a cold morning 14 months ago, which was the first thing she had written in the diary that would eventually bring her here. She thought about how small that first observation had been. One wagon, one anomalous time, one girl in a cold corridor writing it down because it felt wrong, and writing things down was the only tool she had. She thought about where that one observation had led, and the line connecting the 2 points was not straight, and it was not easy, and there were several places along it where she had genuinely not known if she was building toward something or simply accumulating evidence of her own irrelevance. The Steward General's voice read the final verdict into the official record. In the gallery, Elara exhaled once, slowly, and let 8 months go. Afterward, the castle changed in the specific, incremental way that institutions changed when a fixed point that everyone had been orienting around was removed, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, as people who had been waiting to see which direction the current would run began moving in it. The junior administrators from Varick's office, who had cooperated with the investigation, were reassigned to the general administrative pool, most of them with the relieved energy of people who had been holding their breath for a long time and had just been told they could breathe. The Eastern District Oversight Committee was restructured under new leadership with Marin as senior advisor, and the first corrected provision orders went out in the 3rd week, prioritizing the 7 outer districts by degree of shortfall. Elara drafted the allocation correction framework. She had not been asked to. She had looked at the standard reallocation methodology that the provisioner's office was proposing and seen, immediately, that it would replicate the same weight notation error in reverse, overcorrecting the outer districts at the expense of the mid-range districts in a way that would create a new set of shortfalls within 2 seasons. She wrote a 4-page correction to the methodology, sourced it, left it on the provisioner's desk with a note explaining the weight notation issue, and went back to the garrison. The provisioner's office sent it to Marin. Marin sent it to the king. The king implemented it. Nobody asked Elara about this directly for 3 days, and then Marin appeared at the garrison records room where Elara was doing her father's administrative filing and said, without preamble, "The provisioner needs someone who understands the old notation systems, permanently, not as a favor." Elara looked at her. "I have a post," she said. "Gate Security Administration." "Your father has a post," Marin said. "You have been doing your father's administrative filing, your father's record-keeping, your own unsanctioned investigative research, and apparently also the provisioner's methodology corrections, all simultaneously for the better part of a year, without a title or a wage." She looked at Elara with the specific directness of a woman who had spent 30 years watching institutions underpay the people doing their actual work. "I'm offering you both." Elara was quiet for a moment. "Title and wage in the provisioner's office," she said. "Senior records analyst, which is not, I'll acknowledge, a title that reflects the actual scope of what you'd be doing, but it is a title that exists in the charter and therefore cannot be challenged administratively. Marin paused. It's a beginning. A beginning. Elara thought about that word in the specific context of a woman who had spent 8 months working toward an ending, toward the moment when the thing she had documented would be seen and acted on and resolved, the moment she had been able to reach, but never quite fully imagine past. Yes, she said. I'll take it. Marin nodded, with the economy of a woman who had expected that answer and was already thinking about the next item. Start next week. The Eastern District Winter Provision Review needs to be completed before the first spring thaw. She left. Elara sat in the garrison records room for a moment after she was gone, surrounded by the familiar dust and old paper smell of the space she had been quietly occupying for years, and felt the shape of the next chapter settle around her, not as a conclusion to the one that had just closed, but as its own thing, new and uncertain and entirely hers. She found her father at the north gate that evening. He was doing the end-of-day rotation check, the same ritual he performed every evening at the same hour, the reliable rhythm of a man who had built a life around consistency and found, in consistency, something that held. She stood beside him while he worked through the check, and when he was done, he leaned against the gatepost and looked at the road and said, I heard about the provisioner's offer. Word travels fast. Word travels at whatever speed Marin decides it travels. He paused. Are you taking it? I already took it. He nodded, looking at the road. The last light was going off the mountains to the west, and the sky above the ridgeline was the particular deep blue of winter evenings when the cold was real but the clear air made the stars sharp and close. Senior records analyst, he said, with the specific tone of a man testing how a phrase sat. It's a beginning, she said, using Marin's word. He was quiet for a moment, then, Your mother wanted to be a council administrator. Did I ever tell you that? She looked at him. No. Before she came here. Before the garrison. He was still looking at the road. She had the mind for it, better than mine by a long margin, but there wasn't a path then. Not for someone without connections. He paused. She would have been extraordinary. Elara stood with that for a moment, feeling its weight. I know, she said, which was perhaps not precisely true, but was true in the way that mattered. The truth of having always understood, from the quality of the absence, what the shape of the person would have been. Her father put his hand briefly on her shoulder, the same gesture as before, the one that said what he couldn't quite arrange into full sentences. Then he went back to the gate, and she went back toward the castle, and the stars came out over the ridgeline, fierce and clear and indifferent to everything below them, except as a backdrop for the wolves that would run later, when the moon rose. She did not see Kalen privately for 11 days after the council session. This was not an absence. He was present in the work, in the documents that came back with his annotations, in the provisioner decisions that incorporated her methodology corrections, in the systematic, careful rebuilding of the Eastern administrative structure that was moving at exactly the pace of a man who had decided to do it right rather than fast. She was part of that work, and he was part of that work. And they occupied the same institution and breathed the same cold castle air, and the work was real and it was ongoing, and it was, she understood, its own kind of proximity. But for 11 days there was no private study, no two people working late over provisioner records, no particular quality of silence between them. She told herself this was appropriate. She told herself the space made sense. The king had been in the middle of an extraordinary administrative crisis and was now managing its aftermath, and she was a newly appointed records analyst who had been occupying his private study for a week in an unofficial capacity that had made sense in the emergency and now required some reconfiguration. She told herself these things with the conviction of a woman who was good at being honest about most things and had a specific documented history of being less than fully honest about this one. On the 11th day, a page appeared at the provisioner's office with a note. The note said, in handwriting she recognized, "The Palace Garden, when you're done for the day." She read it twice. Then she folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and finished the provision review she was working on. And when the work was done, she went to the palace garden. It was evening. The garden was bare-limbed and geometric in winter, the formal borders showing their structure without the softness of leaves, the paths clear of snow but carrying the cold in their stone. The garden was lit by the low lamps along the main path and the first rise of the moon above the east wall. Kaelin was at the center of the garden, at the stone bench that faced the open ground toward the far wall and the mountain ridgeline beyond it. He was not in council clothes. He was in the practical dark coat he'd worn the night of the emergency assembly, the one that was his rather than his title's. He stood when he heard her come through the gate. She stopped at a reasonable distance and looked at him and waited, because she had learned in 11 days that waiting was something she could do again now. Not the grinding, anxious waiting of the past, but the patient kind, the kind that wasn't afraid of the answer. "I read the diary 3 times, he said. "You told me that," she said. "I know. I'm starting there because the rest of what I need to say connects to it, and I want to be clear about the order." He looked at her steadily, the way he looked at things he had decided to be straightforward about. "The 3rd time I read it, I was not reading it for the evidence." She held his gaze. "I was reading it because of the entries about me," he said, "which I am aware is a thing that a king probably should not admit to a senior records analyst. But I have been in the company of your honesty for long enough that pretending to be less direct than I am feels genuinely impossible." Something moved through her that she made no attempt to manage. "What about them?" she said. "You wrote that you found something in me, when I didn't know I was being watched, that you couldn't look away from." He paused. "I wanted to tell you that the reason I was in the library at 3 in the morning was because I couldn't sleep. And the reason I couldn't sleep was because for 3 weeks I had been watching you from the courtyard and the council corridor and the provisioner's anteroom and could not work out why you were the only person in this castle I was actively looking for in a room before I'd consciously registered that I was doing it." The garden was very quiet. "Your wolf," she said, and it came out more carefully than she intended. "My wolf has been extremely clear about this since the night in the library," he said. "I am the one who took 11 days. She looked at him in the moonlight, this man who had read her 8 months of careful, furious, honest truth and used it to save a kingdom, and then stood in a winter garden and told her the rest of it directly because she had taught him, without meaning to, that directness was better than management. "I wrote things in that diary," she said, "that I would not have written if I had known anyone would read them. I know. They were—" She stopped. "Unguarded. I know." He took 1 step toward her. "I read them as they were written, as the truth." Another step. "I'm asking you to tell me if the truth is still the same." She looked at him. The training yard quality, the inhabiting of presence rather than performance of it, the man rather than the title, standing in the bare winter garden in the practical coat, asking her a direct question and waiting for a direct answer. She had spent 8 months writing truth into the dark. "Yes," she said. "The truth is still the same." He crossed the remaining distance between them. What happened next was quiet and not quiet at once. The particular double quality of a moment that is both exactly what it is and everything that preceded it simultaneously. His hand at the side of her face, and the exhale she didn't know she'd been holding for 11 days, and the specific feeling of something that had been orbiting, finding, finally, its ground. Her wolf went absolutely still. Not the compass needle pull of before, not the aggressively useless reaching towards something she'd been firmly redirecting for months. The stillness of arrival. The particular animal certainty that is not instinct running ahead of reason, but instinct and reason finally occupying the same moment. When they separated, the moon was fully up over the east wall, laying its light across the garden in long, pale lines. "There's something else," he said. She looked up at him. "The council has been discussing the administrative restructuring," he said. "The oversight system, the Eastern District representation, the provisioner reform." He paused. "There is a position that doesn't currently exist in the charter. I've been drafting the framework for it for the past week." "What position?" "Royal Oversight Council. An independent advisory role with full access to administrative records across all departments, reporting directly to the Alpha." He looked at her. "Not a council seat. Not an administrative post in the existing structure. Something new. Specifically designed to ensure that what happened in the Eastern Districts, the systematic suppression of information from the people with the authority to act on it, cannot happen again by structural design." Elara was quiet, processing the shape of what he was describing. "You'd be looking for someone who understood administrative systems," she said. "Someone who had demonstrated over an extended period the specific combination of observation, documentation, and willingness to keep working when no one was paying attention," he said. "Yes, that's a significant position. It's a necessary one." She looked at the ridgeline beyond the garden wall, at the moon above it, at the dark mountain forest running up toward the high ground where the wolves ran on clear nights. "Marin already offered me the provisioner post," she said. "I know. I asked her to." He paused at her look. "Not to give you a lesser position, to give you a beginning," the way she said. "Something in the structure. A foothold." He met her eyes. "This is the next step." She thought about the Miller girl, and the blank variance columns, and a wagon leaving at the wrong hour, and one girl in a cold corridor writing it down because it was what she could do. She thought about what Marin had said. It's a beginning, and the question of where a beginning was supposed to lead. She thought about what it meant to have spent 8 months invisible, and to be standing now in the moonlit garden of Iron Hollow Castle, being asked to be, specifically and permanently and by design, the opposite. "Yes," she said. "I'll take it." Top. 3 weeks later, in the formal council chamber, with all 16 members present and the full official record being taken, Kaelin announced 2 things. The first was the creation of the Royal Oversight Council position, its charter, and its appointment. When he read Elara's name, the council chamber produced a specific quality of silence, not the hostile silence of rejection or the uncomfortable silence of surprise, but the silence of a room full of experienced political operators recognizing, each in their own way and at their own pace, that the shape of the institution they were sitting in had just changed permanently. Councillor Marin did not look surprised. Councillor Bren looked as though he was doing arithmetic again, this time with a different result at the end of it. The Steward General wrote her name into the official record with the careful penmanship of a man who understood that some entries mattered. The second announcement came at the end of the session. He stood at the Alpha's chair and he said, in the same even unhurried voice that he used for everything that mattered most, "I am also informing the Council of my intention to name a Luna. The formal ceremony will be scheduled in the spring, when the Eastern District restoration is at a point where the kingdom can gather to celebrate." The council chamber received this with the specific collective reaction of 12 people simultaneously doing the arithmetic of the past 3 weeks and arriving in quick succession at the same answer. Marin looked at the rear of the chamber where Elara was seated, not at the gallery this time, not at the back wall, but in the official seat that the Royal Oversight Council Charter placed 2 positions down from the Alpha on the right side of the table, and produced the smile she had been controlling since the night of the emergency assembly. Elara looked back at her and felt the chamber around her, its candlelight and its stone, and its 300-year history of decisions made by people with titles and bloodlines and connections that she had none of, and felt it not as a place she had been permitted into, but as a place she had walked into, through a broken latch and a service shaft and a winter garden and 8 months of truth written in the dark and claimed. That night, the moon was full. Elara stood at the edge of the castle's eastern field, at the boundary where the formal grounds ended and the wilderness of the mountain foothills began, and felt the particular electricity that came with the full moon. Not metaphor, not sentiment, but the genuine animal response of a wolf-born person on a clear, cold night with the white light coming down through bare branches and the high ground calling from the ridgeline. She heard him behind her, recognized the step, the weight, the specific quality of a presence she had been recognizing across rooms and corridors and years for long enough that it was no longer something she managed. "Ready?" he said. The same word as the council corridor 3 weeks ago, at the top of the emergency staircase. She looked at the tree line, at the ridge line above it, where the high ground ran clean and clear under the moon. She looked back at him. The Alpha King of Iron Hollow stood at the edge of the wilderness in the moonlight, and the crown and the titles and the council chamber were behind them both, and ahead was the mountain and the cold air and the high ground where the wolves ran. "I've been ready," she said. She had been ready for 8 months. They ran, side by side, into the dark of the mountain forest, up through the tree line and into the open country of the ridge. 2 wolves, an alpha, who had finally become a true king, and the woman whose courage had made him so, running the high ground under the full moon with the kingdom spread out below them, its light small and warm against the vast dark, its people sleeping in the first winter in 3 years that would not end in an empty granary. The wolves ran on, and the kingdom of Iron Hollow, for the first time in 6 long years, began to breathe.